welcome to the Uneventful's channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. In a small town whose name no one living could entirely recall, where the quiet streets folded over themselves like the soft pages of an overused book, there lived a man named Elias, a historian whose life bent toward a peculiar obsession so delicate and so human that it seemed at once absurd and sacred. The blinks of presidents. Elias treated each blink as if it were a punctuation mark in the sprawling sentence of the nation. He recorded their length, their cadence, whether fingers brushed a lapel before or after the eyelids met, the faint tremor that sometimes preceded a long, contemplative closure, and the subtle differences between a blink born of fatigue and one born of the weight of decision. He did not collect blinks to mock or to trivialize. Rather, he believed, with the near-religious certainty of someone who had found a lonely truth and would not relinquish it, that the blink was a tiny, honest motion that betrayed the human beneath the robe and the rhetoric, of vulnerability etched in muscle and reflex. When presidents smiled for cameras, when they delivered grand paragraphs in packed halls, Elias watched the spaces between syllables and measured, creating charts and notations to show that above the thunder of history, there were quiet, repeating heartbeats of habit that could be traced, that might, if read correctly, reveal a different kind of history, one written in human pauses rather than in proclamations. He wrote his notes meticulously in a ledger bound in cracked leather, its spine softened by decades of attention, the pages layered with small annotations, sketches of eyes and slow, looping marginalia. He traveled to archives and press rooms, slipped into the back rows of public addresses, and watched old film reels until the projector light warmed his palms. When he was young, he had believed great events alone made history. As he aged, he began to think that history was equally composed of micro-movements, a mosaic of breaths and blinks that, when assembled correctly, revealed patterns no historian's ledger had ever attempted to capture. People laughed politely at his eccentricity, then grew fond of him, because in Elias there was a sincere curiosity that softened his oddness. He would sit in local cafes and speak in low tones about the differences between a blink that signaled certainty and a blink that signaled being overwhelmed by the immensity of a decision. And though his listeners often carried the conversations away with gentle smiles, a handful left with a newly sharpened awareness of their own faces in the mirror. He kept his work almost entirely to himself, though he allowed occasional articles in small journals, pieces that read like quiet meditations on human nature at the center of public life. He titled his notes "Occasional Apertures," a phrase that both pleased and mildly alarmed his friends, who had not previously thought of the presidential eyelid as a window. For years his ledger grew. The back room of his house, which faced a narrow alley and a stand of sycamores, became a repository of recordings and a map of barely noticed human gestures. One winter afternoon, when the sycamore limbs rattled like an audience settling, Elias received a package with no return address. Inside was a brittle sheet of paper, typed and yellowed, with a list of dates that corresponded not to any presidency he recognized, but to sequences of celestial events described in an ancient hand and footnotes that referenced things called watchers and keepers in languages Elias barely understood. At the bottom, a single line in a softer, darker ink. If you are looking for a pattern, begin at the blink that accepted the burden without complaint. The note was unsigned, and Elias, who had long cultivated a taste for small mysteries, felt the familiar, warm tug of discovery. He cross-referenced the dates and found that they overlapped with accounts from obscure colonial diaries and library logs, that mentioned something far more strange than anyone would expect. References to ritualized watchings, to neighbors who stood silently under to observe someone of supposed importance, and to ancient ledger keepers who recorded not the passing of laws, but the passing of eyes. The more Elias dug, the more his inclination to treat the blink as an isolated curiosity rose into something larger and more ominous, a hidden thread woven through centuries. He found, among the margins of a 17th century sea captain's log, a note about a minister who blinked thrice at midnight, a peculiar line tucked between the weather and the progress of a ship. In a 19th century physician's notes, he came across experimental notations about rest and ocular fatigue among leaders during a smallpox epidemic. Each scrap of evidence suggested that the blink had at times been watched deliberately, as if people understood, long ago, that the human face could transmit truths faster than any public testimony. Elias began to see the outlines of a lost practice, an ancient attentiveness to the unmeasured motions of people who held power. He imagined a ring of quiet watchers through time, librarians with soft hands, clerks with ledger books, apprentices at the edges of great halls, who had believed, against the roar of official record, that the eyelid might contain a language as meaningful as any statute. He felt, with a historian's hunger, that he had stumbled onto a secret archive, not of documents, but of pauses. As the ledger swelled, so did Elias' solitude. He had once been married. The marriage had dissolved years earlier under strains that had less to do with his eccentricities than with the long, loving attention he paid to gestures that felt like treasures no one else would notice. He kept in his house a small radio that crackled with late-night programs about classical music, and when the world outside the windows slipped into its ordinary hum, Elias sat and listened while scratching tiny glyphs beside the times and dates where a blink had meant something to him. One night, while he sat at his desk with a cup of cooling tea and a reel of presidential footage whirring, a distant thunderstorm moved across the town. The power dipped and came back, like a hand lifting and settling, and Elias, who had been summoning courage to follow the invitation of the anonymous note, decided to take a leap. He would test whether a pattern existed, whether the blink might be linked to older, almost ritualistic forms of knowing. He arranged his notes chronologically, added diagrams where he thought in terms of rhythm rather than meaning, and decided to look not only at modern presidents, but at the leaders, magistrates, and known orators recorded across centuries. As he traced the arc from founding fathers to mid-century orators to modern leaders, it appeared that a certain cadence recurred. A long blink at the moment of acknowledging responsibility, a micro-blink after a jibe that landed poorly, tiny repeated blinks when a leader's inner resistance met the force of public expectation. Elias felt the hairs at the back of his neck stand up. The pattern seemed to thrum like a subterranean river, connecting moments of decision. He mapped it with the devotion of a cartographer and found, to his surprise, clusters that coincided with times of national stress, wars declared, treaties signed, crises managed. He hypothesized, with a historian's humility and a poet's audacity, that the blink might be a subtle physiological sign of the mind, negotiating a moral weight. One evening, when rain lashed the panes and the cartoons of thunder rolled lazily over his roof, Elias found a photograph in a burned-out collection from an archivist who had recently died. In the photograph, a group of men sat in a curtained parlor in 1837, and one figure, whose face was partly obscured by shadow, had his eyelids down as if mid-blink. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in a careful hand, "The Keeper." Elias felt, with an immediacy that made him forget to breathe, that he was holding an artifact that hinted at an inherited practice. He followed this thread across a tangle of ledgers and marginalia, and each new find pulled him deeper. He met a retired librarian who remembered, from a childhood told in hushed tones, a story about a keeper who guarded the truth of a town by watching those who led it. The woman spoke of an attic trunk filled with strange notations and a silver device whose purpose had been lost. When Elias opened the trunk, he found a thin brass instrument with two glass panes, like a delicate lorgnette, and in the lining a folded scrap with a map drawn to a place just beyond the town limits, a place where the current map dissolved into blankness. Curiosity, which had always been his compass, now surged into a steady, urgent force. He followed the map through overgrown paths and fields saturated with the scent of wild grasses, and there, behind a collapsed barn, he found a stone well covered in moss. Within the well's mouth, carved with a hand that had worked slowly and with reverence, was a set of initials and a date centuries old. Elias sat on the wet stones and touched the carving, feeling the tiny ridges under his fingertips. In the days that followed, his investigations awakened other locks. He was contacted by a young archivist named, whose eyes contained the exact mix of skepticism and hunger that had once been Elias alone. She had read one of his articles and, intrigued, sent him a scanned box of correspondences found in an estate sale, letters between an early American clerk and a traveling scholar who had written about an ancient practice he called ocular counting, a phrase Elias had never encountered. And Elias, like two halves of a conversation long delayed, began to work together. They exchanged calls late into the night and mapped their discoveries across a table strewn with teacups and film reels. Brought technical skill, an ability to digitize and enhance images, to draw out minute that the naked eye could miss. Elias brought patience, and a voice that scented every discovery with the reverence of someone who had also once loved a life built from small attentions. Their collaboration felt almost like a ritual. When they spoke, the world outside seemed to hush and yield to their purpose. But as they drew nearer to whatever truth lay at the center of their investigations, the mood shifted from quiet joy to a pressure that pressed at the bones. They began to notice oddities. Reels that had been cataloged as public footage were missing frames. Archives had blacked out notations without explanation, and certain librarians and archivists, while polite, would not engage with certain boxes. It was as though a seam in the historical fabric had been stitched over deliberately. When they requested access to a sealed cabinet at the National Library that, according to an old ledger, might contain more correspondence regarding the keepers, they found the cabinet locked with a padlock whose key was gone. Soon after, Elias' phone rang at an hour when only insomnia wakes people. A voice on the other end said nothing but a single sentence: "Let sleeping observers be left to sleep." The voice hung like a shadow, and then the line went dead. Rather than deter them, the cryptic warning intensified Elias' resolve. He followed the clues as if pulling a long, eager thread through the dark. They discovered, hidden behind a set of decoy manuscripts, a folio wrapped in oilcloth containing a cramped, 17th century treatise asserting that the eyelid was a threshold, a small gate between outward performance and inward counsel. The treatise spoke of watchers appointed to note the micro-moments of leaders, who had believed that authority could be read in the body's brief gestures. This was not merely gossip. It was presented as a civic practice intended to preserve accountability in a fragile republic. The authors wrote of methods to read blinks, how to measure them, how to transcribe them into a radical, almost cryptic grammar, so that the populace might know when a leader's words aligned with a visible, involuntary honesty. The discovery felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Elias imagined those early watchers with a tenderness that made his chest ache. Apprentices with candle-lit ledgers, old women who watched from behind lace, children sent to stand by windows to note the passing of an alderman. He imagined a lineage of devotion that had been smoothed away by time, by scandal, by the loud machinery of state. Yet the more tangible evidence they accumulated, the more someone, or something, moved to obstruct them. Files went missing from the library's digital catalog. A locked storage room was found unlocked and then scrubbed. Once, as Elias sat in the library's reading room late at night, the lights dimmed even though no one had touched the switch, and when power returned, a small stack of microfilm that had been on their table lay flipped open as if someone else had been studying it. It was in that charged atmosphere that Elias had a dream, or perhaps not a dream in the most ordinary sense, but a fall into a remembered past. In his sleep, he saw an assembly of watchers in a stone hall whose windows opened on a river of molten silver. They watched not to control, but to keep a memory alive, the memory that human decisions carried a silent weight. He woke with a start and a single line of archaic script swimming in his mind. The eyelid keeps the whisper. He wrote it down in his ledger, down to the last slant of a letter, and felt the presence of a lineage beneath his pen. Their momentum peaked when enhanced a badly exposed reel and discovered something startling. A short clip from a mid-century press conference where, for a fraction of a second, a president's eyes did not close in the ordinary pattern of blinking, but paused in a way that suggested a physical echo. A micro-movement repeated 3 times, like an ancient seal being stamped again and again. And Elias played the clip slowed, frame by frame, until the movement's rhythm became clear. It matched nothing in the known aerodynamic or neurophysiological literature. It seemed, rather, to be a pattern repeated precisely in the curated documents that had guided Elias' search. This repetition was a key, and when they ran their pattern against the centuries of notes in Elias' ledger, a startling calendar emerged, an alignment of micro-movements across leaders that corresponded to dates of deep moral consequence. Someone else, somewhere, had kept a record that mirrored Elias' own, and it was no coincidence. They now faced a question that trembled on the edge of reason. Had the Watchers been an instrument of civic care, or had they been used as a tool to predict and, perhaps, manipulate? The question carried an ethical weight that made both of them breathe differently. The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of a locked vault discovered beneath the collapsed town hall by a contractor clearing debris for a new foundation. The vault's door resisted, then yielded, and inside lay a chest of letters, instruments, and ledgers that chronicled, across decades, the official attempts to institutionalize ocular observation. Policy drafts showed how, in fits and starts, municipal councils and shadow committees considered enshrining observational oversight as a method of accountability. In other papers, though, there were darker proposals, ideas for using observed micro-movements as a way to predict public behavior, to inoculate or nudge a populace. The manuscripts bore the scent of compromise, of a good idea warped by the allure of social control. Elias read them with a mixture of horror and sorrow. He felt the human impulse behind the Watchers, a desire for truth, corruptible by bureaucratic reach. He thought of those who had watched innocently at first, and of those later who might have watched with a rationale that slid toward surveillance. He and argued, late into one night, about whether to publish their findings. Younger and more practical worried about the fallout. Institutions would be shamed or might retaliate. The public might be unsettled. Elias, whose life had been given to small truths, hesitated because he knew how gentle truths could be crushed by violent exposures. The ledger, heavy with years of careful notation, seemed to wait for a choice. It was during this pressure that Elias finally reached the sentence fragment he had long feared might loom at the center of his work. A set of notations that suggested the watchers themselves had been subject to a final, weary decision to hide their own practice, to let their methods sleep rather than let them become instruments of harm. The line, in a letter unsigned and dated in a hand grown shaky with age, read like a small act of conscience. We will close our eyes so the future can learn to read without our hands. The letter's author had chosen sleep as a form of resistance, a withdrawal of a practice rather than its martyrdom. Elias sat back and understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the ledger's last empty pages were not so much an ending as an invitation to return to attentiveness without apparatus. He began to feel, simultaneously, joy and a tide of exhaustion he had not felt in years. It was a fatigue that felt moral, the kind that follows long wrestling with difficult choices. He realized then that he had been living out the practice of the watchers in miniature, observing leaders not to expose them to shame, but to remind a world that people in power remain, fundamentally, human. Urged publication, and they drafted an article that was careful, contextual, and humane. They emphasized the human origins of the practice and the moral choices that had led to its concealment. They suggested a modest proposal, that citizens might, out of their own curiosity and respect, learn to attend to one another's micro-moments as a way to regenerate a civic sense of empathy. They believed in the restorative power of small attention, not surveillance. But as they prepared to send the article to a reputable historical review, Elias felt his body tilt towards sleep, with a weight he could not deny. He had, for weeks, been sleeping lightly. His work and the pressure of discovery had frayed his nights. On the night before submission, as rain tapped a slow, lulling rhythm, and the house filled with the warm, low light of his lamp, Elias sat at his desk with the final paragraph of the article half-written. He wrote the line that would invite readers into a shared practice of small noticing, then paused, resting his pen upon the page. The lamp cast a circle of gold on the paper, and the sycamores outside whispered in slow conversation. Elias' eyes, which had watched so long for tiny movements, finally betrayed him. They closed not with urgency, but with the simple, inevitable tiredness of an old man who had spent a life paying attention and had earned, at last, the right to rest. His pen slipped from his fingers, and his head bent gently toward the ledger as if to whisper to it a benediction. He fell asleep there at his desk, and in the thin space between wake and sleep, he dreamed that he saw the watchers of old arranging their ledgers in a neat row, closing them with care, and laying their hands over the pages like a soft lid. He dreamed that they did not vanish like conspirators, but folded into the long quiet of ordinary life. They became librarians who taught children to notice the way light fell on a face, elders who reminded neighbors to listen, and neighbors who stood vigil in kitchens with battered teapots and kind eyes. When morning came, soft and silver, found him still at the desk, the final sentence of their article trailing into an unfinished thought. He was breathing evenly, face peaceful. The ledger lay open, a small phalanx of notes resting like a gentle testimony to a life turned toward the small truths. Sat down and read the last line he had written before sleep took him. Let us watch one another with the kind of attention that restores rather than breaks. She folded the page gently, and with a tenderness she could not wholly explain, placed it in an envelope addressed to the review they had chosen. She added a short note explaining that Elias had passed, had simply closed his eyes at the end of his work, and that his life's labor was offered in the spirit of communal care. The article was published, modest but steady in tone, and it did not scandalize. Rather, it asked readers to pause and see one another as people who blinked and breathed and sometimes trembled under the weight of responsibility. Some readers mocked the initial idea. Others wrote back with stories of small attention that had changed the course of their days. A few elderly librarians sent letters recalling, with private pleasure, the little practices they had kept for themselves and their towns. The ledger was donated to a small local archive, where children visiting on school trips would sometimes run their fingers along its margins, curious about inked shapes and the image of a man who had loved tiny motions as if they were gifts. The town, too, seemed to change in ways that were quieter than reform but no less profound. Neighbors spoke more gently. People waited for one another in lines with a new civility. And in council meetings, a slow, attentive air settled that made decisions feel less like pronouncements and more like shared responsibilities. The watchers, in the imagined history Elias had reconstructed, had done what those who love a fragile thing do. Sometimes they stepped back so the thing could breathe on its own. In the years that followed, the story of the forgotten historian who dedicated his life to documenting presidential blinks became, in small circles, a parable about the power of attention. Learned to notice the tiny motions of family members, and returned home and noticed differently. Historians argued in journals about whether Elias had found an ancient practice or simply reinvented an ethic of noticing, and both could be true. People continued to fall into the quiet of their days and wake with small, new mercies. As for Elias, he slept his final sleep half bent over his ledger, a smile like a punctuation mark resting at the corners of his mouth, and the town held a simple memorial, not a statue or a plaque grand enough to distract, but a garden with a bench under the sycamores where people could sit and watch the light fall, and allow themselves the gentle, unforced attention Elias had practiced. There they would remember that history is not only made by thunderous acts, but also by the small, steady attentions of those who care enough to observe. And so the world turned, and sometimes, beneath the noise, people found themselves slowing, blinking deliberately as if to test whether the moment was true. In those tiny acts there was a recovery of something ancient and human, the willingness to notice. The hidden truths from the past did not come to rule or to frighten, but to remind and to comfort. They taught that even in great offices, the human body tells a story in small movements that deserve to be read kindly. In the end, the mystery that had begun with an odd ledger and a peculiar habit resolved not as a scandalous revelation, but as an invitation to tend to one another's micro-moments in a manner that is gentle and restorative. Elias, the forgotten historian, had not written a manifesto for surveillance. He had, through patient observation, left a quiet manual for community care. His life became, in the gentle way of stories that grow slowly true, a lullaby for those who worried that nothing small matters. His ledger, with its careful blinks and marginalia, lay in the archive like a fossil of a soft, watchful human practice, and in that stillness, the world found a new capacity for tenderness. For listeners who have kept their own journals, and for those who have watched with curiosity and love, the lesson was simple: to attend lightly, to notice without weaponizing observation, and to allow sleep when weariness comes. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can do for our public life is to rest into our humanity and let the next watchman pick up the pen when it is their time. The story of Elias, his ledger, and the Watchers is not a doctrine but a memory. That human history is woven of both proclamations and blinks, and that sometimes the most humane verdicts arrive not from loud courtrooms but from the quiet of a page gently turned. Elias slept on, his breath a slow, even metronome, and the town outside the sycamores seemed to hold its exhale, as if respecting that deep, earned rest. And in that hush the story stretched itself further, moving through seasons with the deliberate gentleness of a hand turning pages in a book no one hurried to finish. Tended to the ledger as if it were a fragile bird, smoothing the corners of its pages and each tiny notation with the care of someone who is learning how to keep a promise. And in the days that followed, she carried Elias' work into rooms she had not dared enter before, reading aloud in quiet voices to small groups who came out of curiosity and left coated in a pleasant, reflective fatigue. There were librarians who retaught listening hours to children. And in a sheltered wing of the town's community center, an elderly teacher began a weekly session called Noticing, where neighbors practiced watching the way light changed on a face during conversation and marked it with a soft utterance of gratitude. The movement grew slowly, not as a crusade but like the extension of a habit, and because it asked so little, only that people pay attention for a sliver of time, it was received without fanfare and therefore did not alarm, and it spread in the manner of gentle weather, seeding patient attentiveness in kitchens and waiting rooms, in council halls where debates took on a slower cadence, and in markets where sellers and buyers met with a more measured eye, and though nothing dramatic shifted overnight, the small changes accumulated like soft snowfall, muffling the harsh edges of hurried days until, months later, the town felt poor deep different in a way its residents could not have easily explained. Meanwhile traveled with the ledger to a modest conference where a handful of scholars, philosophers, and quiet journalists gathered to hear about ocular counting, as if it were a rediscovered folk practice rather than a thesis for scandal. And the papers presented were cautious, full of hedged language and thoughtful qualifiers. Yet the atmosphere among the attendees was warm and strangely consoling, as if each person had been handed a small, personal manual for gentleness and decided to try it in the rooms of their private life. One historian returned to his mater and quietly introduced a seminar on microhistories that asked students to record the small human gestures around public events. A poet from a neighboring state published a slender volume that took Elias' ledgers as an inspiration and wrote lines that asked readers to be slow witnesses to ordinary scenes. And those poems became bedtime reading in households that had never before thought of political life as something to soothe rather than to inflame. The news cycle, briefly curious and then politely distracted, reported on the ledger in a human interest segment that lingered on the image of Elias asleep at his desk, and the segment sparked an odd cascade of private letters. Some were skeptical and sharp, others were tender and long, and read them all with a patience that made the task feel less like labor and more like tending a community correspondence. Through these letters, people shared memories of grandparents who had kept similar small attentions, of a neighbor who always noticed when someone was tired, of teachers who taught noticing as a method of care, and these recollections braided into a living memory that felt newly possible to modern minds taught to measure only what could be. As the town adjusted and found ways to ritualize simple attentions without letting them calcify into rules, a quieter investigation moved along less conspicuously, and a handful of ethical scholars established a small panel to consider the ledger's implications for modern privacy, and their reports urged a delicate balance, honoring the ledger's spirit without resurrecting the old institutional appetite for monitoring, and their recommendations were deliberate, proposing that any revival of attentional practices be grounded in consent, humility, and a commitment to restorative ends rather than predictive power. And those recommendations, though softly worded, found a modest echo in several civic workshops that taught listening practices in non-judgmental frames, yet not all threads smoothed. Shadows lingered at the periphery, for the ledger's discovery had not been entirely anonymous, and in quiet corridors where decisions are made in ways that must be convenient to those who make them, there were murmurs of discomfort and questions about what other small archives might be tucked away, and some officials, when asked, smiled the polite smile of someone who plans for contingencies, and this subtle unease kept certain boxes sealed, but the town elected, overwhelmingly, to pursue a path of modest transparency. Minutes of meetings were posted in readable language. Neighborhood assemblies invited citizens to sit in and speak without agenda, and the general air of the place took on a texture of assumed trust that was not but chosen. In the meantime, who had once delighted in the crisp efficiency of digital catalogs, found in analog patience a kind of freedom, and she organized slow-viewing gatherings at the community center, where people watched archival footage at reduced speed and practiced numbing sensations rather than leaping to explanations. And the events were almost ritual in their gentle repetitiveness. A bell would ring, a light would be dimmed, people would settle, and someone would read a line from Elias' ledger before the footage began, reminding attendees to notice the small apertures in ordinary faces. And afterward conversations unfolded with a softness that felt like a balm, as people traded stories of small kindnesses that had once been invisible. During a particularly long, drizzly autumn, an itinerant scholar arrived with a folio full of marginalia that suggested the watcher's practice had in distant cultures, tiny practices where watched for signs in eyelids that marked readiness to act, or where village councils used attentive pauses to test sincerity, and these cross-cultural links gave the movement an expanded humility. What Elias had found in the American ledger resonated with ancient human methods of mutual care, and the resonance taught those who studied the ledger to avoid claiming novelty, and instead to adopt a posture of learning from a wider human past. The story also reached into private griefs. Families used the practice to sit with a loved one's silent moments, learning to respect the spaces where words failed, to hold presence without pressing for explanation. And so the ledger's influence worked away from government squares and into kitchens and hospice rooms where the greatest attention is, perhaps, most needed. As years passed, children who had learned noticing in school grew into adults who, when they took civic roles, brought with them the modest ethic their teachers had taught. To pause, to listen, to acknowledge the human beneath titles, and slowly institutional habits shifted where they could. Town councils scheduled listening minutes, in which procedural talk yielded to human testimony, and jury instructions in a nearby county introduced language that encouraged jurors to consider the person before them beyond the sharp edges of testimony. None of this was dramatic, and it seldom led to sweeping laws, but it made governance feel less abstract, more like a communal conversation held in rooms furnished with shared attention. Throughout all this, the ledger remained a quiet center, housed in the small archive with its bench under the sycamores, where visitors left notes and students glyphs into margins of their own notebooks as if to build a personal practice. And each year on the anniversary of Elias' last night, a soft gathering took place. People sat with tea, watched the light, and read a line aloud in turn, allowing the words to fall into the hush like gentle rain. And in that repetition, the town remembered that great things are sometimes the sum of small acts repeated with care. In time, myths gathered around Elia's sleep as myths do, tales that dressed the ledger in more grandeur than it deserved, stories about secret societies and prophetic blink languages. But most who had known the ledger's true texture remembered it as a humble artifact and preferred the best version of the story. That one man's patient attention had nudged a community toward greater kindness, and that his falling asleep at his desk was not a dramatic end but a patient punctuation, an honest closing that invited others to pick up the habit of noticing. And so the town kept on, slow as a tide, finding rest in the ordinary, and the watchers, if they were imagined still to exist, were no longer those who from the shadows but those who, in plain daylight, taught a child to watch the way morning light crosses a neighbor's face and to answer with a small, attentive smile. The years moved forward with the same measured softness that had settled over the town after Elia's passing, and in that gentle forward drift, the ledger became less an artifact and more a kind of shared inheritance, a quiet thread connecting generations who otherwise might not have shared much beyond the streets they walked. Children grew up hearing about Elias not as a figure of eccentric scholarship, but as a man who had taught an entire community to slow itself, to breathe before reacting, to offer attention as a form of care. And in school assemblies, teachers told stories about how noticing small movements, a nervous fidget, a tired blink, a softened jaw, could help people understand one another before misunderstandings hardened into conflict. This small cultural shift was not dramatic enough to draw national attention, yet it changed the atmosphere in ways that even visitors sensed without quite identifying. For they found in public offices a surprising calm, in restaurants an unusual courtesy, in parks a kind of quiet coexistence that felt almost old-fashioned, and occasionally someone passing through would ask about the ledger or the sleepy historian they had heard mentioned in travel blogs. And the townspeople always told the story the same way, gentle, patient, unembellished, as if refusing to let the tale grow into spectacle, for spectacle was the enemy of everything Elias had stood for. Meanwhile continued her work, though she no longer pursued the ledger as an academic project but as a living philosophy. And as she aged, she found herself returning often to the bench beneath the sycamores, sometimes bringing her own notes, sometimes bringing nothing at all, simply sitting and letting the slow passing of light remind her that discovery does not always require movement. Sometimes it requires stillness, a lesson she had learned too late to share with Elias but often repeated in her lectures. Students adored her not because she was flamboyant, but because she was steady, offering guidance in the same cadence with which one might turn a worn book page. And many of those students would later say that classes taught them to become better listeners at home and stronger mediators in their workplaces. And so the culture of noticing expanded outward in quiet ripples, reaching places that had never heard Elias' name, carried by the students he had indirectly shaped, by the articles published, by the occasional documentary that filmed the sycamores in slowly drifting focus. But deeper currents moved beneath these gentle transformations, currents that had begun during the earliest days of Elias' research and had never fully dissolved, currents made up of half-forgotten rumors and fragments of sealed archives. And though the darker institutional interest had largely dissipated after the modest publication of the ledger's ethical summary, certain agencies and scholars continued to wonder whether ocular patterns, if studied rigorously and ethically, might reveal something valuable about stress, truthfulness, or cognitive load. These inquiries never rose to the level of danger, because and her allies insisted, in every forum where they were invited, that attention must never be weaponized, that the ledger's entire purpose had been to elevate empathy rather than to manipulate or predict. And in time these voices, calm, persistent, rooted in Elia's philosophy, became the dominant tone, guiding research away from extraction and toward understanding. Yet even with those safeguards, the mystery of the Watchers remained unresolved, and occasionally, in conferences or late-night discussions among archivists, someone would ask whether the Watchers had truly dissolved into the past, or whether some thread of their lineage had continued quietly, adapting, learning, choosing not to reveal itself. Never answered these questions directly, partly because she did not know and partly because she preferred to focus on what was visible and humane rather than what hid in speculation. But she kept one conviction close, that if any remnant of the Watchers remained, they would not be the shadowy observers of old rumors but ordinary people who chose to anchor their communities with small acts of presence. This belief sustained her in her later years, and when her eyesight began to dim, she found a certain poetic comfort in closing her own eyes for longer and longer blinks, as if practicing the stillness Elias had embodied in his final moment. She continued her work until her hands trembled too much to hold archival pages steady, at which point her students gently took over her responsibilities and encouraged her to rest. And though she resisted at first, insisting there was more to catalog, more to interpret, eventually she accepted the invitation to slow down. She returned often to the sycamore bench, wrapped in a shawl, watching the patterns of sunlight through leaves, nodding to herself how the world continued even without her active tending, how noticing had become self-sustaining in the community. It was during one such quiet afternoon that a young man approached her, holding a notebook full of careful, looping handwriting, and he introduced himself as the grandson of a woman who had once spoken to Elias in about the rhythm of presidential gestures. He explained that he had inherited his grandmother's habit of watching people with patient eyes, and he had begun collecting his own observations, not of presidents, but of everyday people in moments of quiet honesty, and he asked whether the archive might accept his notebook. Touched in a place deeper than pride, told him the truth, that the archive would accept it, and that he should keep writing, not because history demanded it, but because attention was a gift people rarely knew how to give themselves. And so the young man placed his notebook on the shelf beside the ledger, where it rested in the soft gloom of the archive, its pages destined to sit among the growing constellation of minor observations collected by people who had never met Elias, but carried his impulse forward. Over time, the archive grew not in size, but in quiet density, a repository of microhistories that mapped the emotional topography of the town in a manner no census or municipal report ever could. Visitors who flipped through the notebooks often found themselves lulled by the gentleness of the entries, notes about a shopkeeper who blinked rapidly when nervous customers approached, about a teacher who closed her eyes slowly before offering words of comfort, about elders whose expressions softened during storytelling, and about children whose eagerness spilled into every gesture. And in reading these observations, visitors felt their own breath slow, their shoulders unclench, their minds soften into the awareness that life was mostly made of these tiny, human moments. And so the town became known, quietly, as a place where people rested more easily, not because they escaped the world's troubles, but because they moved through them with the unhurried cadence of those who had learned to see and be seen gently. Travelers who stayed a while often reported falling asleep more deeply than they had in years, lulled by the collective softness of a community that treated attention as a kind of shared canopy. And though legends continued to swirl about the Watchers, about secret techniques and hidden societies, the townspeople largely ignored these embellishments, preferring the simple truth that the only Watchers who mattered were the ones who sat at bus stops observing the sky, or the ones who paused in conversation to make space for someone else's weariness, or the ones who closed their eyes for a moment before speaking, offering silence as a small balm. Eventually passed away peacefully, her final days marked by the same stillness she had spent her life cultivating. And when the community held her memorial under the sycamores, the people spoke not of discoveries or academic achievements, but of the way she listened, the way she taught others to slow themselves, the way she honored Elias by carrying forward the practice of humane attentiveness. After her passing, the bench beneath the sycamores gained a companion, a second bench, placed respectfully at an angle, so that those who sat could feel as if they shared a quiet conversation with those who had come before. Seasons turned, generations shifted, and the ledger remained not as a relic of eccentric obsession, but as a testament to how one person's quiet devotion could ripple outward until an entire community, and eventually many beyond it, learned to breathe differently. And whenever someone new discovered the story of the sleepy historian who had documented blinks, they expected to find a tale of absurdity or obsession. But instead they encountered a soft invitation to see the world more kindly, to sit more often in silence, to listen without rushing to respond. And thus the story drifted forward through time like a low, warm wind at dusk, carrying with it the lingering reminder that the smallest gestures can carry the gentlest truths, and that sometimes the most meaningful histories unfold not in the loud chambers of power, but in the quiet rooms where someone sits, watching the light change, holding a pen loosely until sleep takes them, reminding the world without ever needing to announce it that peace can be practiced in the space between blinks. And so the years continued their slow, drowsy drift, carrying the town and its people along as if on a gentle current, a current so steady and rhythmic that no one ever felt hurried, only guided, as though time itself had adopted the soft, deliberate blinking cadence Elias once studied with such devotion. By the time a new generation grew into adulthood, the story of the sleepy historian was no longer spoken with surprise or amusement, but with the same warm familiarity reserved for lullabies, told in classrooms, whispered during late-night walks, referenced by elders who smiled at the memory of how everything had changed quietly, like the gradual dimming of daylight that no one notices until the lamps glow. Among this new generation was a young woman named, a soft-voiced archivist in training who had grown up hearing bedtime stories from her grandmother about the early days of the ledger's rediscovery, stories full of small kindnesses and long, thoughtful pauses. And though she had never met Elias she walked through the archive as though greeting old friends each morning, running her fingertips lightly along the spines of the notebooks added over the decades, feeling a hum of comfort beneath the paper as if the quiet attentions of past observers still lingered in the fibers, approached her work with a mellow curiosity, not sharp like academic hunger, but warm, diffused, like the curiosity that grows from years of contemplating still water. And under her care, the archive expanded in an unexpected direction. She began recording oral histories from residents who, though they never wrote in notebooks, had spent their lives practicing the art of noticing in their own ways. She recorded fishermen who watched the tremble of water before storms, bakers who could tell a customer's mood by the slowness of their exhale, gardeners who understood the subtle sag of leaves before rain, teachers who recognized quiet grief in a student's posture long before the child found words. And all these stories, once gathered, grew into a vast anthology of attentiveness that complemented the ledger without overshadowing it. As visitors listened to these recordings, played softly in a small room where curtains filtered the sunlight into warm gold, they often found themselves breathing more deeply, their thoughts unspooling like yarn in gentle hands, and noticed that many people fell asleep in the listening chairs, lulled not by boredom, but by the soothing cadence of ordinary kindnesses spoken aloud. Meanwhile, the broader world, though chaotic in its own sprawling way, began to absorb faint traces of the philosophy that had germinated in the town. Journalists wrote articles about the slow attention movement. Psychologists cited the ledger as an example of community-based emotional attunement, and educators introduced mindful noticing exercises inspired, though often indirectly, by the town's culture. And though most people beyond the town never learned the full story of Elias, his legacy drifted outward in diluted but benevolent forms, like the faint spread of lantern light across dark water. Still, despite all the outward ripples, the town itself remained anchored in the original quiet ethos, neither proud nor performative about its identity, simply content to continue living at the border between wakefulness and daydream, where attention felt like a soft blanket laid over the world. It was in this settled era that a curious phenomenon began to surface. Visitors reported vivid dreams after spending an evening in the archive or sitting beneath the sycamores, dreams in which they wandered through vast libraries without walls, following slow-moving figures who pointed toward shelves, where books blinked their pages open and shut like gentle eyelids. Some dreamed of Elias himself, not as a historical figure, but as an old man smiling from a desk scattered with starlight rather than paper. And these dreams left people waking with a sense of deep rest and fragile wonder. Word of these dreams spread quietly, and more visitors came, seeking nothing more than a night of peaceful sleep. And often they found it, curling up in local inns, lulled by the town's soft cadence and the faint rustle of sycamore leaves whispering in the dusk. Ever humble, did not attribute these dreams to mystical forces, but to the accumulated calm that generations had tended, a collective stillness so pervasive it seeped into the mind like a gentle tide, washing away the noise of the outside world until only tranquility remained. She often said, when asked, that the town was not magical, only attentive, and that attentiveness, when practiced long enough, becomes indistinguishable from magic, an idea that visitors carried home like a small stone kept in the pocket for comfort. But beneath the calm surface, a deeper thread continued to tug its curiosity, a question that had lingered since she was a child. Who had sent the anonymous note to Elias, the one that first suggested a deeper pattern behind the blinks? The original note had been preserved in the archive, its ink faded but its message still legible, and every time she read it she felt the faintest shiver of possibility, as though a ghost of intention hovered between the words. She researched quietly, never wanting to disturb the peace the town valued, following lines of inquiry long dismissed, obscure correspondences between early clerks, coded marginalia in centuries-old journals, hints of shared practices between distant communities. Slowly, piece by patient piece, a picture emerged, not of a secret organization or a shadowy surveillance group, but of a simple, almost tender tradition passed quietly through families, where elders taught children not techniques of monitoring but rituals of gentle watching. How to see the tiredness in a loved one's face, how to understand the unsaid ache behind a slowed blink, how to be present without expectation. It became clear that the Watchers, in their original form, had never been a group defined by power. They had been defined by care, by the belief that attentiveness was a form of love. And though institutions had once tried to harness this practice for their own ends, the truest lineage had survived only in families who practiced quiet compassion. When discovered this, she felt something settle inside her, like a book closing with a soft sigh. She realized that the anonymous note to Elias had likely been sent by someone who recognized in him a kindred spirit, a gentle observer who would never misuse the knowledge he found. And in that recognition, the sender had offered him a doorway, trusting him to walk through with integrity. And so the story of the Watchers, once tangled in mystery, softened into something far more human, a lineage of people committed to understanding others through small, patient signs. With this understanding, added a final section to the archive, a shelf labeled Continuing Watchers, not in homage to surveillance, but in celebration of those who practiced compassionate attention in their daily lives. Nurses, caretakers, teachers, neighbors, anyone who offered presence without demand. Visitors added names to the shelf, names of people who had listened to them, supported them, understood them when no one else did. And over time, the shelf became a gentle memorial, not to the past, but to the present kindnesses that kept communities whole. And thus the story, far from ending, continued to unfold in soft spirals, each generation inheriting the practice of noticing the way one might inherit a grandmother's rocking chair or a grandfather's wristwatch, an heirloom not of material value, but of rhythm, a rhythm that slowed the pulse and calmed the breath. And so the sleepy town, once unknown, became a quiet sanctuary for weary travelers, a place where people arrived carrying tension and left carrying silence, where the sycamores swayed like patient guardians and the bench beneath them remained a place of stillness, where one might sit and listen to the faint hum of a world learning, slowly and gently, how to notice itself into peace. As the decades drifted onward with the same slow, drowsy gentleness that had come to define the town's rhythm, the archive beneath the sycamores continued to grow, not quickly, not in any way that demanded notice, but in a soft, almost organic fashion, like moss spreading across an old stone wall. The notebooks, recordings, and quiet testimonies came to form a living ecosystem of attentiveness, each new contribution layering itself softly atop the last, until the shelves held not just the remnants of a forgotten historian's work, but the accumulated breadth of generations who had learned to watch the world through patient, half-lidded eyes. The town changed so gradually that no one could ever say precisely when it happened, only that the attitudes of the people seemed to drift into a shared cadence, a collective exhale that never quite ended. The streets became quieter but not silent, the kind of quiet shaped by unspoken understanding rather than absence. Conversations grew slower. Arguments softened before they could escalate. Even the animals seemed to absorb the calm. Stray cats lounged longer in sunny patches. Birds nested lower in the trees as though trusting the ground below. And the town's dogs walked with a trotting gentleness, pausing now and then to gaze into doorways, as if studying the expressions of those inside. Children, who once grew restless in classrooms, learned to embrace the lessons of noticing taught through the stories of Elias and lessons about reading a room, recognizing when a classmate felt left out, understanding that silence didn't always need to be filled. They practiced blink-watching not as a science but as a quiet game of empathy, discovering who was tired, who was daydreaming, who needed company, and who needed space. For them, the ledger was not an artifact of eccentric scholarship. It was a bedtime story turned guiding principle, a reminder that the smallest human gestures could hold the deepest meaning when observed with care. Growing older but never losing the warm quietness in her voice, began hosting evening gatherings in the archive courtyard under the canopy of sycamores. These gatherings had no agenda and no intended outcome. People simply arrived, speaking in low tones or not speaking at all, resting on benches or reclining on blankets while the dusk settled like a soft shawl across their shoulders. Would sometimes read a line from Elias' ledger, but more often she chose silence, letting the rustle of leaves and the chorus of insects carry whatever message the evening wished to offer. One night during one such gathering, a visitor spoke, a tired man from a distant, bustling city who had come seeking the town's rumored calm. He said he had heard that something about this place made people dream differently, more peacefully, with images that left a soft imprint even after waking. Nodded, though she claimed no magic. She explained only that the town did not rush the mind, and when the mind is not rushed, it remembers how to rest. The man fell asleep soon after, his head resting against the trunk of the sycamore, and when he woke at dawn, he wept softly, not from sadness but from the unremembered relief of uninterrupted rest. Slowly more visitors came, not seekers of spectacle but seekers of stillness. They arrived weary, overwhelmed, sometimes carrying burdens they could not name. And the town, with its quiet hum and its soft-eyed residents, absorbed them gently. Some stayed for only a night, others for weeks, and a few remained for years, until the rhythm of noticing settled so deeply into their bones that they could no longer imagine living without it. Among the visitors who stayed was a painter named Wouldn, whose work had grown frantic and chaotic in the city's relentless pulse. Here, in the town's unhurried air, Wouldn rediscovered a forgotten softness in their brushstrokes. Instead of bold, restless colors, their canvases began to fill with gentle gradients of dusk and dawn, translucent shadows, the slow closure of eyelids, and the quiet turning of pages. Their paintings captured the spirit of the town so tenderly that residents often saw themselves in the images, not their faces, but their way of being. Wouldn's most cherished work, however, was a portrait of Elias painted entirely from imagination, inspired by the stories shared. In the portrait, Elias sat at his desk with his head tilted slightly forward, eyes half closed as if listening to something only he could hear, his ledger open before him like an invitation. The painting became a fixture in the archive, and those who looked at it long enough often felt a heaviness in their eyelids, as though Elias himself were gently reminding them to rest. In time, a subtle but remarkable phenomenon began to unfold. The town's nights grew noticeably quieter, not simply due to reduced activity, but because the sleep that settled over the community felt unusually deep, a shared slumber that radiated outward like a soft tide. Visitors described the experience as drifting into a sleep that felt both ancient and familiar, as though they were resting in the cradle of a memory carried forward across generations. Some reported hearing faint whispers in their dreams, soft, indistinguishable murmurs like pages turning or eyelids fluttering, but always soothing, never alarming. As the town embraced its identity as a sanctuary of attentiveness, found herself drawn more frequently to the original ledger, the one Elias had filled so carefully over his lifetime. She studied its ink, its patterns, the rhythm of Elias' handwriting, searching not for new mysteries but for the comfort of continuity. She came to see the ledger not just as a record of blinks, but as a record of presence, of a life lived in deep observation. And in her own quiet way, she vowed to carry forward that presence as long as she lived. But time, in its steady, unhurried way, eventually touched bones, slowing her step and softening her voice. She trained a group of young apprentices, gentle souls who had grown up under the sycamores and had learned to notice the world with a patience usually reserved for old poets. These apprentices became the new caretakers of the ledger, of the archive, of the nightly gatherings in the courtyard. His final days were spent much like Elias' last moments, seated at a desk near the window, a soft glow surrounding her as she arranged notes and gently folded pages. And one morning, when the sycamores cast long shadows across her room, she closed her eyes for what she thought would be only a moment of rest. Instead, she drifted into a sleep so calm and deep that those who found her later felt no grief, only gratitude. She had joined the quiet lineage of sleepers who had carried the town's philosophy into the world. The apprentices honored her by adding a new ledger to the archive, a simple book with soft, unlined pages titled Observations. It contained no entries, only blank space, an invitation for future generations to fill with their own gentle noticing. And the town continued, as it always had in its soft rhythm, slow blinks, slow breaths, slow understanding, resting in the knowledge that its story, like its people, would drift onward not in noise but in quiet continuity, a gentle lullaby whispered from generation to generation, never hurried, never forced, simply unfolding in the natural cadence of a world that had learned how to rest. The town's quiet rhythm endured long after its passing, settling deeper into the soil, the buildings, the slow-turning seasons, until even newcomers felt as if they had stepped into a place shaped not by time, but by the soft intention of those who had lived gently before them. The apprentices she trained continued their work with a humble devotion that never sought recognition. They opened the archive each morning with the same slow, deliberate care Elias once used to open his ledger, as though waking a sleeping friend. They dusted shelves, repaired aging bindings, transcribed fading ink, and greeted visitors with warm nods rather than hurried words. Over time, each apprentice developed their own manner of noticing. One became skilled at reading the micro-expressions of children. Another sensed the unspoken worries of travelers. Another listened so closely that people swore they felt lighter just speaking to him. It was one of the apprentices, a quiet young man named Juniper, who first sensed that the town's culture of attentiveness was beginning to shape not only people's daily lives, but the landscape itself. He noticed, on long morning walks, that the sycamore leaves seemed to sway in gentler arcs, as though moving in sync with the town's measured breathing. He observed that the river beyond the fields flowed in a more consistent murmur, its surface smoothing itself, as though respecting the calm radiating from the town. Even the fog that settled in early dawn seemed softer, drifting through the streets with the cautious tenderness of someone entering a room where people slept. There was no magic in these observations, only the subtle reflection of a community's quiet interior life made visible, as though the world around them had learned to mirror their gentlest intentions. Juniper shared these impressions with the other apprentices, and though they smiled at his poetic phrasing, each of them privately noticed similar patterns. One morning, after a night of unusually heavy dreaming shared by several residents, they gathered beneath the sycamores and discussed whether they should document these changes. They ultimately decided to create a new ledger, one quite different from Elia's original work. Instead of blinks or human gestures, this ledger would record the ways the environment responded to the town's calm. The softened wind, the odd quietness of birds at dusk, the peculiar way rain fell as though trying not to disturb sleepers. They called it the Ledger of the Land, and though they never claimed scientific rigor, the pages became a gentle testament to the interconnectedness of attentiveness and the world it touched. Visitors found themselves drawn to this ledger as much as to Elias' original. Many commented that its entries induced a dreamy heaviness in the chest, a kind of softened awareness that made them feel momentarily detached from the hurried pace of their own lives. Some fell asleep while reading it, heads resting on the archive's wooden tables, the sound of their faint breathing blending seamlessly with the steady rustling of leaves outside. Perhaps the most remarkable effect the ledger had was on people who came seeking healing, not of body, but of mind. Those overwhelmed by grief or worry often reported that reading the environmental reflections in the ledger of the land gave them a sense of being held by something vast and gentle, something that required nothing from them except stillness. Therapists who visited the town later wrote papers about its ambient attentiveness, describing it as a form of communal care so subtle and consistent that it coaxed even the most restless minds into rest. In the evenings, the apprentices continued gatherings in the courtyard, though each gathering took on a slightly different flavor depending on who led it. Juniper's gatherings were marked by long periods of silence, punctuated by soft notes played on a wooden flute. Another apprentice, Myra, preferred to read small excerpts from forgotten diaries and letters, fragile fragments of lives lived slowly, stories that lulled listeners into a gentle haze. A third apprentice, Rowan, the painter who had once been a visitor, created shadow painting evenings, where dim lanterns projected soft, trembling patterns onto the archive walls while people reclined and allowed their minds to wander. No two gatherings were alike, yet each left its participants with the same drifting, drowsy satisfaction. As these gatherings continued, the town began attracting a particular group of travelers, writers, musicians, scholars, and wanderers whose creativity had been worn thin by the noise of the outside world. They came not in search of inspiration but in search of rest, and in that restfulness, inspiration often returned in unexpected ways. Poems written in the town carried the cadence of slow footsteps across wooden floors. Paintings created in the studios overlooking the sycamores displayed soft gradients of near-sleep colors. Stories crafted in the dim corners of inns unfurled in long, gentle arcs, mirroring the dreamy quality of the town's atmosphere. Some of these works were published or exhibited beyond the town, and while the creators seldom mentioned the town by name, preferring to keep it a sanctuary, the influence of the town's quiet attentiveness spread outward in the subtleties of their art. Readers and viewers far away reported feeling inexplicably soothed by these works, their minds slowing, their breath deepening, as though they had caught a faint whisper of the town's rhythm without ever having seen its sycamores. The apprentices observed this with quiet wonder, recognizing that they were not merely preserving a legacy. They were part of a living continuum, a lineage of gentle watchers who shaped the world not through grand gestures, but through the soft accumulation of small, caring acts. One evening, during a particularly tranquil gathering, Myra found herself gazing up through the sycamore branches at the night sky. The stars appeared unusually steady, as if holding their twinkle for just a moment longer, listening. She felt a warmth in her chest and realized that the story of Elias, of the watchers before them, was no longer a narrative of a few individuals. It had become something far larger, a quiet tradition that folded itself seamlessly into the lives of everyone who passed through the town. And so the story continued, slow and drowsy and impossibly gentle, drifting across generations like a long exhale held in the soft cradle of twilight. The ledger remained open, the benches beneath the sycamores remained occupied, and the town, always watching, always breathing, always noticing, rested in the endless, comforting certainty that its most important work would always be done in silence, in softness, in the space between blinks. The seasons continued their unhurried drift across the town, layering soft years atop one another like blankets folded neatly at the foot of a bed, until time itself seemed to adopt the place's rhythm. Long, slow, careful, always moving but never rushing. The apprentices grew older, their movements gaining the same unintentional grace that had once characterized Elias, and and though they never sought leadership, they gradually became the gentle heartbeats of the community, steady and quietly present. Juniper, whose sensitivity to the land had awakened the idea of the ledger of the land, spent much of his later life tending the space around the sycamore grove. He learned the growth patterns of the trees, the specific song of the cicadas in early summer, the way fog curled around the roots in the hour before sunrise. His observations filled multiple volumes, not with scientific categorization, but with soft, poetic descriptions of how the wind paused before storm clouds arrived, how the moon's reflection lingered longer on the river's surface on nights when people gathered for shared silence, how the earth seemed to sigh after heavy rain as though finally granted permission to rest. These entries did not claim insight. They offered companionship, inviting readers to slow down long enough to sense the subtle harmony between human calm and the land's response. Myra continued capturing the town's voice through the diaries she collected. She wandered from porch to porch, from marketplace to riverside, listening to the murmured recollections of elders who remembered early days, or of young parents who described noticing the first time their child paused long enough to observe another person. She recorded stories of small reconciliations, neighbors who resolved lifelong misunderstandings through a single moment of eye contact, estranged siblings who reunited after realizing they still remembered the rhythm of each other's breathing, quiet heartbreaks soothed by the simple presence of someone who knew how to sit without speaking. These stories accumulated like sediment, soft and layered, creating a gentle narrative landscape of human connection. Rowan, aging slowly with paint still under their fingernails, transformed the old town hall into a sanctuary of color. The walls were covered in ever-expanding murals, vast dreamscapes painted in muted twilight shades, lavenders, slate blues, sleepy golds, that blended into one another like memories too soft to distinguish. In these murals, Elia's imagined figure appeared often, not as a scholar surrounded by stacks of paper, but as a kindly observer seated beneath the sycamores, hands open on his knees, eyes half closed in peaceful understanding. Visitors described entering the hall as stepping into the midst of a shared dream, one that breathed with them, slowed with them, whispered them into a state of gentle repose. The more the town matured into its identity, the more the outside world seemed to take notice in unexpected ways. A handful of researchers arrived, not those seeking to revive old surveillance practices, but people drawn by curiosity about the town's curious serenity. They observed, quietly and with respect, the way residents interacted, the slow shapes of their conversations, the near-universal absence of raised voices. They studied the nightly gatherings beneath the sycamores, attempting to understand how such a simple ritual could bring about such soothing cohesion. But their notes, no matter how rigorously structured, never quite captured the essence. After weeks of observation, many researchers found themselves setting aside their instruments and simply sitting among the townspeople, absorbing the atmosphere until their shoulders softened, their sleep deepened, and their approach shifted from analysis to participation. One such researcher, a neuroscientist named Dr. Haven, stayed far longer than she intended. She had arrived hopping to study the physiological effects of the town's slow-living culture, curious whether the heartbeat or breath patterns of residents differed significantly from those living in cities. But as days stretched into weeks, she realized that her research questions dissolved in the town's quiet rhythm. Instead of measuring brain waves or heart rhythms, she found herself writing long, unhurried letters to friends, letters describing the feeling of sitting beside the river at dusk, the subtle shimmer of fireflies drifting like sleepy sparks, the sensation of breathing in sync with strangers during the nightly gatherings. Eventually, she contributed her own notebook to the archive, a book titled Notes on the Resting Mind, filled with gentle reflections rather than scientific conclusions. Some evenings, when the apprentices led gatherings, Dr. Haven sat among them and sensed something remarkable, that when dozens of people breathed together under the wide canopy of sycamores, the shared silence gathered weight, as though the air itself thickened with restfulness. People described leaving these gatherings walking slower, their thoughts quieter, their dreams more vivid and restful. Not because of any ritual or magic, but because rest had become the town's native dialect, spoken in every gesture and inhaled in every breeze. Years passed and the town's fame, if it could be called fame, spread further, though always in soft whispers rather than loud announcements. Travel journals wrote about it in footnotes, a place where time seems to nap, a village where the air feels like an exhale, a town that dreams even when you're awake. Artists and poets came for sabbaticals. Musicians composed lullabies inspired by its rhythm. Elderly couples spent their final years here, soothed by the sense that they were living inside a long, gentle dream. But even with these gentle arrivals, the town resisted transformation. It did not grow commercialized. It did not rush to accommodate tourists. It simply adjusted, slowly and quietly, as it always had, making space for each new soul to rest without altering its own core cadence. Eventually, a new generation of children, of apprentices, began crafting their own practices. Some created tiny stone altars near the river, where people could leave notes of gratitude or grief. Others taught themselves to read the quiet emotional tone of a room the way one might read music. A young boy named Alder, curious and introspective, began collecting the subtle patterns of people's footsteps, claiming he could tell who was content, anxious, sleepy, or thoughtful based on the sound of their walk. His notebook, filled with tiny rhythmic annotations, soon joined the archive. Alder's Footfall Guide, a whimsical yet strangely accurate catalog of human moods translated into sound. One evening, after a particularly gentle rainfall, the apprentices gathered together inside the archive and spoke of the strange beauty of watching the town evolve. Juniper, older now and moving with a slow, deliberate grace, said that the town had become something akin to a living organism, a creature nourished by attention, breathing slowly, sleeping deeply. Myra added that Elia's legacy had grown beyond any single notebook. It had become a culture, a tapestry, a shared lullaby. Rowan suggested that perhaps the Watchers had never disappeared, only transformed, that anyone who listened deeply enough, watched gently enough, belonged to their lineage. And no one disagreed. Outside, the sycamores swayed softly in the night breeze, their branches whispering rhythms that lulled even the stars into stillness. The river flowed with its gentle murmur. Lamps glowed like half-lidded eyes. And the town breathed, slow and steady, resting in the unbroken continuity of its story. A story that would drift on, quiet as moonlight, into whatever future waited beyond the next long, peaceful blink. The town's slow, dreamlike rhythm deepened yet further as the years unfurled, layering one atop another in such a seamless drift that time felt less like a linear march and more like a soft spiral, looping gently back on itself. The apprentices aged gracefully, their steps growing softer, their voices becoming quieter, as though the town itself was teaching them how to settle into the same measured cadence that shaped its seasons. and the younger generation, those who had grown up beneath the sycamores, who had learned from the stories of Elias and in the same way others learned arithmetic or lullabies, took up their places with an effortless serenity, as though they had always belonged to this continuum of gentle watchers. With each passing year, the archive evolved into a sanctuary unlike any other. Though no one ever spoke of it in grand terms, those who entered often felt as if they had stepped into a dream made physical, a place where time seemed to lie down and stretch itself across the floorboards. Notebooks lined the shelves in every direction, each one filled with careful observations. The rise and fall of someone's shoulders during a moment of confession, the tremble of a hand before an apology, the slow lifting of an eyelid at dawn, the quiet fatigue in a farmer's gaze after harvest, the softened laughter of friends reunited after years apart. These were the town stories, not the dramatic or the monumental, but the small, deeply human moments the world outside rarely paused long enough to notice. One day, a group arrived at the archive for their first formal lesson in noticing. They entered in a polite hush, gazing up at the high shelves and the soft drift of dust illuminated by warm morning light. Their teacher, a woman named who had once been one of Myra's students, guided them to a small table where 3 notebooks awaited them. Each notebook was blank except for the first page, where a single line was written in a looping hand. A gentle watcher observes without taking. A gentle watcher listens without asking. A gentle watcher cares without expecting. The children read the lines aloud together, their voices high and uncertain, but something in the cadence of the words made them fall quiet. Then asked them to sit anywhere they liked, on benches, on the floor, against the window, and simply watch. Not with judgment, not with the intention to fix or analyze, but with soft curiosity. Some watched the sycamore shadows flicker across the walls, others the gentle rise of dust motes, others the subtle breathing of classmates. For many of them, it was the first time they had felt what the adults often described, the sensation that noticing itself was a form of rest. Over time, the children became contributors to the archive in ways no one expected. They documented not in words alone, but in drawings, in soft crayon lines capturing the way twilight glowed on rooftops, in watercolor smudges showing the relaxed posture of a napping dog, in charcoal sketches of elders sitting together in companionable silence. Their contributions eventually formed a new section known as the Gallery of Quiet Moments, and visitors often spent hours wandering through it, lulled by the purity of a child's perspective, an attentiveness untouched by haste. Beyond the archive, the entire town had begun to adopt its own unwritten rituals. At midday, when sunlight slanted through windows in long golden beams, people paused in their tasks, not in a formalized observance, but in the natural rhythm of a community that had learned to listen inward. Shops dimmed their lanterns for a few minutes. Conversation softened into whispers. Farmers rested their hands on fence posts, breathing in the slow breeze. Students folded their notebooks and watched the fluttering shadows on their desks. Visitors described the town at midday as slipping briefly into a collective dream, a moment so calming that even birds perched silently, their feathers settling like blanket corners. Even the river adapted to the town's rhythm. It had always been gentle, but now its flow seemed to match the pace of human breath, steady, unhurried, murmuring like a lullaby whispered by the land itself. People spent long evenings along its banks, some writing in their journals, some reading, others simply dipping their fingers into the cool water and watching the ripples expand. The river became, in many ways, an extension of the archive, a natural ledger where changes in weather, mood, and season inscribed themselves in liquid lines. But perhaps the most remarkable evolution occurred not in the land or the archive, but in the dreams of those who slept within the town. These dreams grew softer, longer, and more vivid, drifting through the minds of sleepers like gentle currents, carrying them through memories they never fully remembered, but always felt comforted by. People dreamt of vast, quiet halls filled with shelves of sighing books, of forest paths lit by lanterns that flickered in time with the heartbeat of the earth, of figures who resembled Elias or perhaps no one at all, figures who stood silently beside them, guiding them deeper into rest simply by being present. Some dreamers described seeing not individuals but impressions, blurred silhouettes of watchers old and new, human and perhaps more than human, though never threatening. These shapes moved through the dreams with slow, deliberate motions, as though teaching sleepers how to breathe, how to notice, how to let go. When people woke, they often felt as though someone had gently lifted a burden from their chest during the night. Among those who studied these dreams, not scientifically but lovingly, was Alder, the once young boy who had footfalls. Now older, Alder had begun documenting the rhythms of dreams themselves, listening as residents described their nightly voyages. He noted the consistency of recurring themes: slow corridors, soft lights, patient figures, the sense of being watched not with scrutiny but with affection. He compiled these into a series of slim volumes titled The Atlas of Sleep, which quickly became one of the archive's most cherished collections. These volumes offered not interpretations, but companionship, a reassurance that dreams were not isolated experiences, but part of the town's larger, ongoing lullaby. As all of these gentle practices flourished, it became evident that the town had quietly transformed into a sanctuary, not only for rest, but for renewal. People arrived exhausted, overwhelmed, or heartbroken, and though the townspeople never promised healing, healing happened anyway, slowly, softly, through the cumulative force of attention, silence, and presence. And through it all, the legacy of Elias, once a peculiar historian recording the blinks of presidents, remained at the center, not as a monument but as a quiet pulse, a reminder that the smallest acts of noticing can change not only a person, not only a community, but the very atmosphere in which life unfolds. And so the story continued, endlessly and effortlessly, drifting forward in the same rhythm as the town itself. A rhythm shaped by eyelids closing in rest, by breath slowing at dusk, by soft footsteps echoing in the archive's wooden halls, by the timeless whisper of sycamore leaves swaying above generations who learned, again and again, how to live gently in a world that so often forgets to blink. And still the story drifted onward, slower than memory yet steadier than breath, as the town settled ever deeper into the gentle cadence it had cultivated across generations. It was a place now known not by any official name printed on maps, those always felt too sharp, too defined, but by the way travelers described it upon returning home, a town that moved like a sigh, a place where ideas arrived only when invited, a community that lived inside a perpetual twilight of calm. No borders marked its edges. Rather, its presence radiated outward like a warm pulse, felt long after one stepped beyond its fields. As Alder's Atlas of Sleep expanded across several volumes, he began noticing a curious trend within the dream descriptions. The Watchers, those indistinct figures that appeared in so many residents' sleep, seemed to be growing clearer, not in a strange or supernatural sense, but in a way that reflected the town's comfort with its own lineage. Figures once described as silhouettes or gentle blurs now appeared as softened faces, peaceful presences with features reminiscent of real people. Sometimes they resembled elders who had recently passed. Sometimes they echoed the quiet expressions of current apprentices. And sometimes, without explanation, the dream figures looked like Elias, his head tilted as if listening, his eyelids hovering at the edge of sleep, his ledger resting beneath his hand like a companion. These dreams did not trouble anyone. If anything, they comforted. The dream watchers offered no commands, posed no riddles, issued no warnings. They simply existed beside the townspeople, the way a parent might sit in a room where a child naps, not watching closely but offering presence as a form of care. Alder theorized, quietly, without urgency, that these dream visitors were not supernatural echoes at all, but psychological resonances of a community that had spent generations practicing restful attentiveness. In other words, the watchers were not ghosts. They were reflections of a culture that had learned to rest with its eyes open. Meanwhile, Juniper spent more time in the sycamore grove, his hair silvering in thin, windswept strands. He had begun to notice subtle changes in the trees, changes so slight they might have been overlooked by anyone other than a man trained to see meaning in the smallest gestures. The sycamores grew taller, yes, but they also seemed to lean, very gradually, toward the archive's center courtyard, as though drawn by the concentration of slow, restful gathering that took place beneath their branches. Their roots wove more deeply into the soil, intertwining with one another in patterns Juniper had never seen before. Bark grew smoother in some places, resembling the soft ripples of a closed eyelid. When wind blew through the grove, it carried not the wild rustle of forests elsewhere, but a padded, almost muffled whisper, like the sound of a page being turned in a quiet room. Juniper recorded these observations in a series of notebooks wind tone studies, root drift notes. Though the apprentices sometimes teased him for the poetic nature of his work, they always read his entries with a reverence that bordered on ritual. Visitors often asked whether the sycamores possessed some inherent enchantment, but Juniper always smiled softly and said the trees were simply responding to the atmosphere of a community that lived in a state of shared gentleness. "Everything learns from what it lives beside," he would murmur. "Even the silent things." Myra, too, noticed changes, not in the environment but in the cadence of people's lives. Conversations had grown even slower than in her youth, but not out of hesitation or distraction. Rather, it was as though the residents savored the spaces between words, letting sentences stretch like soft ribbons that never tightened. She noticed, too, that people had begun sleeping more deeply, not out of exhaustion but out of trust. Children fell asleep in classrooms during afternoon reading, without embarrassment. Elders dozed contentedly on porches mid-conversation. Merchants nodded off behind counters during slow hours, only to be gently awakened by customers who smiled rather than scolded. Perhaps the most profound shift Myra observed was the disappearance of loneliness. Not that solitude vanished, solitude thrived in this town, but loneliness, that aching absence of connection, grew rare. People spent time alone without feeling abandoned. They spent time together without feeling obliged. Privacy and presence existed side by side, as complementary forces rather than opposing ones. One quiet winter, when snow drifted across the rooftops like feathers shaken from a great pillow in the sky, a traveling choir arrived unexpectedly. They were weary from months of touring, their voices nearly frayed from constant performance. Hearing rumors of the town's restful atmosphere, they asked if they might stay for a few nights to recover. The apprentices welcomed them, offering warm blankets and 2 small community halls where they could sleep. Something remarkable happened on their 3rd evening. Without planning it, the choir gathered beneath the sycamores during one of the nightly gatherings. No one asked them to sing. No one expected anything from them. They simply stood among the residents, listening to the soft winter wind move through the branches. Then, as if compelled by the peaceful cadence of the night, the choir began to hum, a single, low tone that vibrated through the courtyard like a gentle tremor. The townspeople did not join in. They listened, their breathing sinking to the slow rise and fall of the choir's voices. The hum deepened, broadened, softening into a lullaby so tender it sounded like the world itself preparing to sleep. Snow drifted down noiselessly, gathering on coats and hair, melting on warm cheeks. By the time the last note faded, half the people present had fallen asleep where they sat. The choir members, too, felt their bodies loosening, their minds drifting in a warm haze they hadn't experienced in years. They slept soundly that night, so soundly that several later reported it was the first time in their adult lives they dreamed in colors muted like dawn. The choir left days later, their voices restored, not by practice but by rest. Before leaving, they recorded a final soft hum beneath the sycamores. The apprentices stored the recording in the archive, where visitors could listen to it through padded headphones. Many fell asleep within minutes. News of the choir's experience drifted outward slowly, like a drowsy breeze carrying the scent of warm bread. Soon other weary travelers, nurses, teachers, caretakers, social workers, found their way to the town, worn thin by the weight of their responsibilities. And like all who came before, they found their burdens slowly loosening, dissolving into the shared calm that infused every corner of the place. As the decades continued their slow roll, no single event ever defined the town's story. There were no tragedies, no upheavals, no sudden revelations. Instead, there was only the long, continuous unfolding of gentle attentiveness. A town living inside a centuries-long exhale. A community united by the smallest gestures. A legacy held in the space between blinks. And still the story continued, soft, steady, endless, as though the town itself were writing a sleep-drenched tale across time, word by unhurried word, carried forward by every whisper of sycamore leaves, every restful dream, every quiet watcher who understood that sometimes the most profound histories are the ones written not in noise, but in silence. And still the town drifted deeper into its gentle, unbroken rhythm, moving through time as though resting in the soft cradle of a dream that had no true beginning and no need for an ending. Seasons curled around one another like sleepy animals settling in for a long winter. The sky seemed always a few shades softer than elsewhere, pale in the morning, muted at noon, dusky in the evenings, mirroring the calm that had seeped so thoroughly into the soil that even distant weather patterns appeared to respect it. By now, several generations had passed since Elia's final night at his desk. His legacy had dissolved into the lifeblood of the community, not as a story retold, but as an instinct inherited, an instinct to notice gently, listen slowly, breathe deliberately. People no longer referenced his ledger directly. Instead, they lived its philosophy without thinking, the way a sleeper reaches instinctively for the warmest part of the blanket. Yet new chapters of the town's quiet story continued unfolding in subtle, nearly imperceptible ways. One winter, A child named Curious, bright-eyed, prone to long silences that puzzled adults elsewhere but were cherished here, began spending entire afternoons in the archive. He didn't read the ledgers at first. Instead, he wandered between the shelves, touching their spines lightly with his fingertips, as though listening for vibrations. He said he could feel stories humming inside them, not as words but as warmth, like someone whispering just out of hearing. The apprentices watched this with mild wonder. They had seen many unusual forms of attentiveness in the town: children who could sense emotions through posture, elders who understood the meaning of a person's sigh. But its ability seemed different, more inward. One afternoon, as snow whispered against the window glass, Juniper approached the boy and asked gently what he felt when he walked among the shelves. Considered this for a long moment, so long that Juniper nearly the question. But then the boy looked up with soft, thoughtful eyes and said, "It feels like the shelves are breathing. Like they're trying not to wake anyone." Juniper felt a warmth spread through his chest. Not surprise, not concern, but recognition. He made a note in his own ledger that day. Some children understand the language of rest before they understand spoken language. His quiet reading practice soon evolved into a project of his own. Instead of writing observations about people, he began sketching the breaths he sensed in objects: the long, slow exhale of an old doorframe, the faint murmur of dust settling, the rhythmic pulse of a lantern's flame. His drawings became a new archive collection, titled Contours of Stillness. Visitors often fell into a drowsy peace while viewing it, lulled into sleep by the soft lines, the thatched textures, the almost imperceptible suggestion of slow movement. Meanwhile, life continued its sleepy tide outside the archive. Even the marketplace, the liveliest part of town by most measures, moved at a pace that felt dreamlike. Vendors arranged their goods in patterns resembling resting shapes: folded cloths that mimicked sleeping hills, baskets arranged like stacked pillows, jars aligned with the soft symmetry of closed eyelids. Shoppers drifted rather than walked, pausing to look at wares with a calm that suggested they were contemplating not purchases, but small moments of beauty. Conversation in the marketplace was never hurried. People spoke as though each sentence was a stone dipped in water, sending gentle ripples outward. If a disagreement arose, it softened itself long before it could stir tension. A raised voice was so rare that, when it happened once, a startled shout from a traveler who dropped a ceramic bowl, every resident instinctively paused, offering him the kind of gentle gaze that quieted the moment faster than apology ever could. Nightly gatherings under the sycamores remained a cornerstone of community life. As generations passed, different apprentices and residents led the gatherings with their own unique forms of quiet expression. Some nights, someone brought a bowl of warm herbs and let the gentle scent drift into the air like a calming fog. Other nights, Rowan projected soft watercolor patterns onto the tree trunks, letting shifting colors mimic the slow ripple of dreams. Sometimes, no one led anything at all. The townspeople simply gathered, breathing together, listening to the wind weave itself through the branches in tones that resembled distant humming. The watchers of dreams, the gentle dream figures seen by so many residents, grew more familiar over the years. Some people dreamt of Elias. Others dreamt of. Many dreamt of anonymous watchers whose presence felt so comforting that waking brought no sorrow, only a soft residue of tranquility. Alder continued to record these accounts in later volumes of the Atlas of Sleep, noting recurrent themes that deepened over time: doors opening onto quiet landscapes, rivers that mirrored the night sky, hands guiding without touching, the sense of being accompanied by someone who expected nothing and offered everything. No one feared these dreams. They were seen as part of the town's natural rhythm, as ordinary as rainfall or morning fog. Some believed the dream watchers were just memories echoing through the collective mind. Others believed they were symbols of the community's cumulative compassion. A few whispered that the watchers were simply the most restful parts of themselves appearing in a form they could understand. In any case, the dreams soothed more than they puzzled. Years folded themselves into soft bundles, and eventually the original apprentices, Juniper, Myra, Rowan, became elders themselves, moving with the slow, graceful patience of people who had lived their entire lives in alignment with the town's gentle tempo. When Juniper grew too weak to walk the sycamore grove each morning, younger residents carried his chair beneath the trees so he could listen to the wind. When Myra's eyesight dimmed, children read aloud the diaries she once collected, their voices rising and falling like soft tides. When Rowan's hands trembled too much to paint, the town's youth brought pigments to her bedside and painted under her instruction, their brushstrokes learning the rhythm of her lifelong calm. Eventually, one by one, the elders slipped quietly into their final sleeps, each drifting away with the same peace that had shaped their lives. And though the town mourned them, the grief was soft and warm, not sharp or destabilizing. Their absence felt more like a gentle hand withdrawn from the back of a chair than a light extinguished. New apprentices stepped into their roles effortlessly, for the town itself had been teaching them since birth. And so the town continued, endlessly, gracefully, tenderly, like a breath that had forgotten how to end. The sycamore swayed in rhythms older than the people below them. Lanterns glowed like sleepy stars. The river murmured in its familiar lullaby tone. And the watchers, whether real, remembered, or imagined, remained present in every gesture, every blink, every quiet moment held between two people who understood one another simply by sharing silence. The story still drifted outward, as soft and continuous as ever, carrying forward through the generations with no urgency, no conclusion, and no need for either. Just the long, drowsy certainty that a life shaped by gentle noticing will always ripple outward, soothing the world one quiet breath at a time. And still the town drifted onward, deeper into its quiet eternity, its days unfolding with such patient softness that even the concept of time seemed to bow its head in deference. No one hurried here. Not the wind, not the river, not the people, not even the dreams that visited sleepers each night as gently as a hand settling over a blanket. Over the decades, the community became something almost more felt than seen, a place where tranquility was not merely practiced but lived, breathed, shared, and passed onward like an heirloom quilt. Children born into this atmosphere grew up knowing how to listen with their entire bodies. Elders lived long, untroubled lives, their years extending not through medicine alone but through rest, mutual care, and the absence of emotional strain. Even the animals moved with a certain deliberateness. Cats napped in long, purring arcs atop warm windowsills. Birds rarely startled. Instead, they fluttered down in slow spirals. Dogs wandered through town like gentle sentinels, pausing beside benches as though checking on sleepers. And the archive, always the quiet heart of the town, continued expanding, deepening, softening. Its wooden floors grew polished not from cleaning, but from the slow shuffling of countless feet over years of peaceful footsteps. Shelves groaned softly with age, though never in complaint, They seemed to enjoy the weight of their contents, their grains darkening in places where fingertips lingered most. One generation of apprentices gave way to another, and then another. By now, no one needed instruction to understand how to tend the ledger collections. The rhythm of the town guided every new apprentice naturally. Open the archive slowly, welcome visitors quietly, treat every page like a half-sleeping creature. It was during one particularly long, drowsy summer that new layers of the town's story began to unfold. A small group of travelers arrived, not seekers of rest, nor artists, nor scholars, but people who had heard rumors of a peculiar thing, that the town possessed a rhythm capable of easing even the most restless minds. These travelers were insomniacs, people who had spent years wandering through countless nights without finding rest. Their eyes carried the dull sheen of exhaustion, their breaths shallow, their movements stiff with the weight of sleepless decades. They did not announce themselves as a group. They arrived separately, days or weeks apart, drawn by the faint trail of stories whispered from traveler to traveler. They came expecting nothing, because life had taught them to expect nothing, but the town welcomed them the way it welcomed everyone, gently, quietly, without ceremony. At first, sleep did not come easily to them. They lay in the soft beds of the local inns, listening to the rustle of sycamore leaves and the hum of distant gatherings, but rest clung to the edges of their consciousness like a shy visitor unsure of its welcome. Yet something subtle shifted within them. Their breathing lengthened. Their thoughts slowed. Their bodies loosened. On the fifth night, one among them, an older woman named, felt her eyelids grow heavy while sitting beneath the sycamores. She leaned back against the bark, listening to the quiet murmur of the townspeople's breathing, and her head lowered slowly, gently, as though guided by unseen hands. She fell asleep there in the open air, something she had not done since childhood. When she woke hours later, she wept, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar softness she felt inside her chest. Word of rest drifted through the town like a tender breeze. Soon, other insomniacs found themselves drifting into sleep during the nightly gatherings, some leaning against tree trunks, some lying on cool grass, some resting their heads on folded jackets. The watchers in their dreams appeared, as always, not with answers or cures, but with presence. And presence was enough. By autumn, a remarkable shift had taken place. Nearly every insomniac who had arrived weary and hollow-eyed now slept deeply, consistently. Their transformations were so gentle, so quiet, that no one thought to call them miraculous. The town simply nurtured them back into the rhythm of rest, the way a forest nurtures its trees without announcing its role. Alder recorded these events in a new volume of The Atlas of Sleep, describing the slow reintegration of restless minds into a communal cadence. He noted the nights when the watchers appeared more frequently in dreams. He recorded how some dreamers saw Elias sitting beside them with a half-smile, while others saw only the soft glow of lantern light guiding them deeper into slumber. As these insomniacs regained their rest, they offered something unexpected in return: stories of the world beyond the town. They spoke of cities that never slept, of people who lived decades without silence, of nights pierced by constant lights and machines. Their stories were not told as warnings, merely as truths, but the apprentices felt a quiet ache when listening. They realized how rare their town truly was, a sanctuary whose quiet was not born of isolation, but of intention. This realization sparked a gentle question among some younger residents. Should the town share its practices outward more deliberately? not as doctrine or program, but as invitation. At first, older residents hesitated. The town had always grown naturally, softly, without outreach. But the younger generation, those who had never known a world without the archives' guidance, believed that gentleness could ripple outward without disturbing their own tranquility. They began cautiously to create rest bundles for travelers, small cloth pouches filled with simple items, handwritten notes on deep breathing, gently worded observations from the ledger, leaves from the sycamore trees, recordings of the choir's hum. These bundles were not marketed. They were offered quietly, without expectation, given freely to those who passed through the town. To their surprise, travelers began returning months later, reporting that the bundles had shaped their daily routines, helping them create tiny sanctuaries of rest within their hectic worlds. Some began noticing their loved ones more deeply. Some revived forgotten practices of quiet dinners, slow walks, gentle listening. Some even started small noticing circles in there, meeting weekly to breathe together and share soft observations. The apprentices realized then that rest was not diminished when shared. It like light reflected across water. Meanwhile, the town itself continued to change, almost imperceptibly, in response to its growing culture of deep rest. The lampposts glowed a little warmer in the evenings. The river's murmur deepened into a steady bass. The sycamores grew broader canopies, their branches forming natural parasols over pathways. Houses were built with wide windows and soft corners. Even the sound of footsteps on cobblestone seemed to soften, as though the stones themselves had learned the value of gentleness. All the while, the watchers in dreams remained constant companions. Some residents claimed they could feel the watchers even when awake, felt them in moments of long pauses, in the quiet stillness before a question is answered, in the way two pairs of eyes meet across a room with mutual understanding. Whether these watchers were memories, metaphors, or something more, no one troubled themselves with certainty. The town had no need for explanation. Mystery in this place was simply another form of rest. And so the story continued, deeper and softer, drifting through generations like a lullaby woven into the air itself, unbroken, unhurried, endlessly unfolding in the same calm rhythm that had guided Elia's pen on the night he fell asleep at his desk, and inadvertently began a legacy of rest that would ripple across centuries. The town kept breathing. The sycamores kept whispering. The people kept dreaming. And so the years drifted on, slow as settling dust in a sunlit room, soft as breath released after a long-forgotten worry. The town moved deeper into its identity, not by growth, not by change, but by deepening, the way a river slowly carves its own bed over centuries, becoming more itself with each passing season. By now, no one could remember a time when rest had not been the town's native language. Children learned it from the rhythm of footsteps in the marketplace, from the hush of the archive's wooden halls, from the nocturnal gatherings beneath the sycamores where dreams pooled like warm water. Teenagers, instead of rebelling against stillness, embraced it as an anchor during the gentle turbulence of becoming. Elders found in it a comfort that drew their final years into a soft, steady glow. But in this era of deep calm, something new, something subtle and almost imperceptible, began to emerge. It started with the river. One early spring morning, when mist lay low over the water like a blanket drawn halfway up a sleeping form, Alder noticed an unusual stillness. The river flowed, of course, it always had, But that morning its movement was so slow, so uniform, that it seemed almost deliberate, as if the water itself had learned to mimic the town's steady breath. He knelt on the bank, letting his fingers trail just above the surface. The current hummed, not audibly but in sensation, a faint vibration against the skin. A pulse not unlike a heartbeat. A rhythm in perfect sync, with the breeze stirring the sycamore leaves upriver. Alder wrote about this in the volume of The Atlas of Sleep. The entry was brief but tender. The river rests with us now. At first, only Alder spoke of noticing the river's new cadence. But soon others mentioned it in small, passing comments. How the reflections on the water seemed to hold their shape longer. How stones beneath the surface appeared clearer. How even the frogs' calls aligned with the river's quiet pulse. The apprentices gathered to discuss the shift. They agreed it was not magic, not omen, not something to fear. It was simply another expression of the town's gentle influence. A natural world shaped by a human rhythm of rest. But what none of them yet realized was that this was merely the beginning. Later that summer, a quiet tremor passed through the sycamore grove, not a tremor of the earth, but something like a collective shiver of leaves, as if the trees themselves exhaled in unison. A visitor sitting beneath the grove felt the subtle rumble travel through the ground into their spine, and though startled, found the sensation deeply comforting, like being wrapped in a warm blanket by unseen hands. Juniper, now elderly and soft-voiced, observed this with reverence. He placed both palms against one of the trunks and whispered, "You've learned from us, haven't you?" The tree did not move in response, but Juniper felt a faint warmth beneath the bark, pulsing like slow breath. He wrote his final entry in the ledger of the land. "The trees keep watch now, as we once did." As months slipped by, more residents began sensing subtle signs. Lantern flames that flickered in slow, steady intervals identical to calm heartbeats. Door hinges that no longer creaked abruptly, but opened with a soft, sigh-like hum. Shadows that stretched and contracted not with mechanical precision, but with an oddly lifelike rhythm. Visitors described the town as alive with quietness, a phrase no resident disputed. Then, one autumn evening, something extraordinary happened beneath the sycamores. During a gathering where the townspeople breathed together in shared silence, tiny sparks of light appeared among the branches. At first, people assumed they were fireflies. But the lights did not flutter or drift, they pulsed. Slowly, softly, exactly in time with the collective inhale and exhale of the crowd below. When the people slowed their breathing, the lights slowed. When they deepened their breath, the lights matched. When the gathering paused in stillness, the lights hovered motionless, glowing faintly like eyelids half closed. No one panicked. No one spoke. No one rose from their seat. Instead, a soft wave of awe washed through the grove. For in that moment, every person present understood that the town had crossed some invisible threshold. Rest was no longer something practiced, or taught, or instilled. It was shared. The land, the light, the wind, the river, everything breathed with the people. Rowan, watching the glowing canopy reflected in the eyes of the attendees, whispered, "We are dreaming together now." After that night, the lights, nicknamed, appeared whenever the town reached a certain collective calm. They hovered in winter fog, drifted through open windows, shimmered in the rafters of the archive. Children cupped their hands beneath them. Elders napped beneath their glow. Travelers wept at the sight, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming sense of safety it inspired. Dream watchers became more vivid in the dreams that followed. Some dreamers reported sitting at long tables with Elias and writing in ledgers made of starlight. Others walked through vast landscapes shaped from soft light and shadow, guided by figures whose features shifted gently between familiar faces and unknown silhouettes. A few claimed they heard the town breathing, a deep, serene inhale that stretched across the sky. As always, the town did not seek explanation. Its residents simply noticed, appreciated, rested within the mystery rather than seeking to solve it. And so the story continued, not merely as a human tale now, but as an entwined narrative of land and people, of rest and rhythm, of silence so deep it rewrote the pulse of the world around it. The town kept dreaming. The river kept humming. The sycamores kept whispering. The lights kept glowing in time with communal breath. And the watchers, soft, patient, ever-present, remained at the edges of sight and the heart of dreams, guiding the town ever deeper into the long, peaceful continuum of its own gentle existence. The story, unhurried as always, drifted onward, quiet, endless, soft as a blink settling into sleep. The story drifted onward, softer still, as though the entire town were being lulled deeper into a timeless cradle of rest, one woven not from myth or miracle, but from generations of quiet harmony between people, land, and the unseen presence that had always watched over both. In the years that followed the first appearance of the lights, the town entered what many later called the Great Stillness. It was not an era defined by a single event or transformation, but by a collective deepening. Everything, absolutely everything, began to move with an even finer, slower grace. The pace of life did not stop. It simply became so gentle that even time itself seemed reluctant to intrude. Shops still opened, but at hours that reflected the natural waking rhythms of their owners. Meals were still shared, but each one felt like a small ceremony of gratitude. Still learned lessons, but they learned them through stories, through silence, through attentive observation rather than rote instruction. The town's rituals, if they could be called rituals, had become as unconscious as breathing. Meanwhile, the lights continued their quiet watch. Night after night, they pulsed among the sycamores in the courtyard like tiny lanterns suspended in the slow heartbeat of the town. Their glow was never bright, more like the soft shimmer of distant star reflections on water. People often found themselves falling asleep beneath them, curled under blankets or leaning against the warm trunks of the old trees. Alder, watching this unfold with gentle fascination, revised the final volume of the Atlas of Sleep. He added a chapter titled Shared Breath, a series of careful observations about how they responded not to individuals, but to the collective emotional state of the town. It glowed when the town was most unified in calm. It dimmed only when someone in the community carried heartbreak or grief. And that, too, shaped a new custom. When the dimmed, even slightly, locals instinctively checked on one another. Not frantically, not urgently, but with quiet presence. Someone might place a warm drink on a neighbor's step. Another might sit beside an elder in silence. Someone else might leave a folded blanket on a bench, knowing someone would need it. In this way, grief never had to run alone through the town. It was always met by warmth before it could settle too deeply. Because of this, even sorrow became soft. But the real turning point, the shift that brought the town deeper still into its shared dream, came one spring when the lights began drifting beyond the sycamore grove. At first, they moved no farther than a few paces beyond the tree canopy, hovering above the path that led toward the river. But within weeks, more lights appeared, tiny, shimmering motes that pulsed in sync with the original grove lights, spreading like a quiet tide. Soon they floated above rooftops. They shimmered along fences. They drifted through open windows in the late evenings, settling above beds like luminous guardians. Visitors were awestruck. Residents accepted it with a calm awe, never frightened, always grateful. Something beyond understanding was happening, but it had the texture of peace, not mystery. It was during this time that a new figure appeared in the town's dreams. Until then, dream watchers had always been vague shapes or familiar faces softened by sleep. But now dreamers began speaking of a single presence, a tall, calm figure wrapped in faint light, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Their features shifted slightly depending on the dreamer, but the presence was always the same, a being of pure rest, an embodiment of the town's collective gentleness. Dreamers described this figure as someone who knew everything I never said aloud, like a memory I had before I was born, a quiet companion who breathed when I forgot to. And most remarkably, they blinked the way Elias blinked in the stories. The apprentices took note of this, though not with alarm, rather with reverence. They believed the town had finally crystallized its identity into a symbolic form within the dream lives of its people. The dream figure, whom they simply called the Still One, became the gentle myth of the new era, a symbol of the town's own resting heart. During waking hours, people sometimes felt a faint warmth behind them, like someone standing just beyond sight. Not haunting, comforting, as though rest itself were a companion. The land, too, seemed to lean into this new harmony. Grass grew softer. Stones warmed slightly in the afternoon sun. The river's murmur deepened into a thrumming lullaby, felt more in the bones than heard in the ears. Even storms arrived quietly, rolling in with muted thunder that sounded more like a sky clearing its throat than a force of disruption. And perhaps the most extraordinary change came in the form of a new, spontaneous ritual that emerged among the youngest children. Without instruction, without prompting, the children began gathering each dusk on the hillside above the town. They would sit in a loose circle facing the valley, their backs warmed by the sinking sun, and they would begin humming, a soft, uncoordinated hum, each child choosing their own note. But miraculously, the hum always converged into a single tone, a tone that matched the low vibration of the river, a tone that pulsed with the same rhythm as a tone that aligned perfectly with the breath of the Still One in dreams. As they hummed, lights rose from the valley like glowing seeds drifting upward to join the children. And when the children eventually stopped humming in their soft, natural way, the lights settled gently back down, returning to rooftops and treetops and the quiet corners where peace lingered longest. No adult ever taught them this ritual. They simply knew it. The apprentices wondered aloud if perhaps the town itself had begun teaching its children. Years passed, then more years. Yet the story went on, soft as a sigh, long as an unbroken dream. People still arrived weary and left renewed. Dreams still glowed with watchers and quiet landscapes. The river still hummed its lullaby. The sycamores still whispered their slow, ancient counsel. The lights still floated through twilight like pieces of a dream that had escaped sleep's boundary. And the town, gentle, timeless, endlessly resting, continued writing its history in the space between breaths, where stories drift not toward endings, but toward deeper and deeper quiet. And still the story drifted on, quiet, unhurried, and impossibly soft, as if the town itself were exhaling endlessly into the fabric of time. Nothing in this place unfolded sharply or suddenly. Everything, from the shifting of seasons to the turning of a page in the archive, moved with a slowness that felt intentional, warm, and anchoring. As the decades stretched into centuries, the town slipped so thoroughly into its identity of restfulness that even the notion of age lost some of its meaning. Elders lived long and gently, their final years marked not by frailty, but by a kind of graceful slowing that brought them ever closer to the rhythm of the land. Children grew up learning attentiveness not from lessons, but from the quiet example set by everyone and everything around them. Even the animals seemed to enter a dreamlike state of companionship with the people, moving through the town with deliberate calm, as though participating in the same ancient ritual. Over time, the lights, the drifting, pulsing points of soft illumination, became as much a part of the town's nightly landscape as the stars themselves. They floated above rooftops, hovered over footpaths, and sometimes slipped through open doorways, bathing rooms in a muted glow that made even the most restless visitor feel their thoughts slowing, softening, dissolving like sugar in warm water. Then one evening, something subtle yet profound occurred. A group of traveling astronomers arrived, weary and weather-beaten from months of chasing constellations across distant horizons. They pitched their instruments on the hillside above the town, intending to map star patterns unaffected by city light. But as night deepened, they noticed, first with confusion, then with a gentle wonder, that the stars above the town appeared to move differently. Not drastically, not impossibly, just softly. Constellations seemed to breathe, not in literal motion, but in subtle shifts of brightness. Stars glowed a touch warmer. Their twinkle fell into quiet synchronicity with the rise and fall of the townspeople's collective breath. The astronomers recorded the phenomenon meticulously, recalibrated their instruments, adjusted their lenses, and attempted every rational explanation. But nothing changed what they saw. The sky above the town was resting with the town. Word spread in scientific circles, quietly, hesitantly, for the astronomers feared ridicule, but no explanation emerged beyond metaphors. Scholars wrote papers describing the atmosphere as anomalously harmonious, density shifted, microcyclically luminescent. Yet each concluded that the effect, whatever its origin, had no adverse impact on the cosmos. If anything, it was beneficial. The astronomers themselves experienced the deepest sleep of their lives after their observations, falling asleep beside their telescopes, heads resting on their star charts like children returning to a familiar lullaby. One astronomer, a woman named who suffered lifelong migraines and restless nights, stayed for several months. She became enamored with the emerging collective dream culture. Night after night, she recorded the experiences of the townspeople, their dream landscapes, their watchers, their slow-lit corridors into the subconscious. Her journals filled dozens of notebooks, each one capturing a different layer of what she called the ecology of communal rest. But the most startling discovery came when she began comparing dream patterns among residents. She noticed that certain dreams, symbols, shapes, sensations, always appeared on the same nights for multiple dreamers. A river glowing silver, a field full of bending trees, a figure standing in soft light, eyes half-lidded, as if waiting for someone to arrive. a distant hum that seemed to cradle the dreamer's heartbeat. The presence of Elias or unnamed watchers, appearing in the same dream to people who had never spoken to one another. These dreams did not happen every night. They drifted through the town like shared tides, arriving softly, touching hundreds of minds at once, then receding gently until the next cycle. Called this phenomenon collective dreaming waves, not because she understood their cause, but because the metaphor fit perfectly. She joined the nightly gatherings beneath the sycamores, hopping to observe some catalyst, but found instead that the gatherings themselves were part of the dreaming ecosystem. A slow braid of breath, silence, presence, and rest once again weaving itself into the unconscious lives of those gathered. During one such gathering, something extraordinary happened. The lights began moving in a new pattern. Instead of drifting aimlessly or poolsing gently above the crowd, they descended in delicate arcs, forming a loose ring around the people seated beneath the sycamores. The lights floated at shoulder height, each one brightening and dimming in soft unison. The trees overhead swayed in a barely noticeable rhythm. The ground vibrated faintly, like a cat purring beneath the soil. Then from somewhere beyond the grove, perhaps from memory, perhaps from dream, a quiet presence seemed to enter the circle. No one saw it directly. No one heard footsteps or felt a breeze. But each person became aware in the deepest, most instinctual way that the still one, the dream figure who represented the essence of the town, was present. A sense of calm washed through the grove so completely that several people drifted instantly into sleep where they sat. Those who remained awake experienced something even softer, a feeling of being gently watched over, not judged, not measured, simply accompanied. The presence lingered like a thickening of the air, a softening of the world's edges, a warmth blooming behind closed eyes. And then, as quietly as it had arrived, it faded, dissolving into the faint glow of the lights and the deep, resonant hush of the trees. After that night, the town shifted once more. Dreams deepened, becoming more vivid but also more unified. People awoke with knowledge they had not learned in waking life, gentle insights, symbolic truths, emotional clarity. They felt more rested, more connected, more attuned to one another than before. The land responded too. Grass bent in graceful arcs when residents walked. Water rippled in patterns that matched collective breaths. Birds began singing melodies that subtly reflected the hum of the gatherings. Even the clouds learned to drift slower above the valley, casting long, sleepy shadows over the rooftops. The apprentices realized something profound. Rest had become more than a practice, more than a culture, more even than a shared dream. Rest had become the town's language, its atmosphere, its identity, its living heartbeat. And so the story continued, soft, deep, and endless, like the finest thread of a dream that refuses to end, because waking would offer nothing as gentle. The people breathed. The land breathed. The dream watcher breathed. The lights pulsed in eternal with all of it. And the town, wrapped in perpetual twilight calm, drifted ever further into the continuum of peaceful existence, where time no longer measured hours, but heartbeats and history wrote itself in the spaces between blinks. And still the town drifted forward, if forward was even the right word anymore, because nothing here moved in lines or timelines or sequences. Life unfolded in quiet layers, like the rings inside an ancient tree. Soft, concentric expansions of rest, subtle deepening rather than progression. By now, the world beyond the town had come to treat it as a kind of legend. Travelers spoke of it as if it existed somewhere half in reality, half in dream, that place where even the stars breathe slower, the valley where people sleep in harmony, the village lit by floating lights that follow the pulse of the night. Yet those who tried to map it precisely often failed, as if the town revealed itself only to those who approached with the right kind of softness. Within the town, however, nothing felt mystical or grand. Everything was simply gentle. And it was in this gentleness that the next subtle evolution began. The lights, once mere drifting embers of communal calm, began to respond in new ways, not only to emotion, breath, or presence, but to memory. It began with a simple gesture. One evening, as dusk settled into its usual lavender tones, a young woman named Born and raised beneath the glow of the walked through the sycamore grove carrying a journal. Her grandmother had passed earlier that year, and she often read the old woman's stories beneath the trees to feel close to her. As she opened the journal to a page filled with looping handwriting, the lights above her did something they had never done before. They descended. Slowly, gently, a cluster of lights floated downward until they hovered just inches above the page. Their soft glow illuminated the words, casting them in a warm, amber radiance. As read aloud, the lights pulsed, not in the rhythm of the town's breath, as they usually did, but in the rhythm of her grandmother's handwriting. Long strokes, short curves, the pace of a life that had once flowed across the page. The lights mimicked it, echoed it, honored it. Other townspeople watched in quiet wonder. They approached cautiously, opening their own journals, diaries, letters from loved ones long past. Each time they responded uniquely, sometimes swirling, sometimes slowing, sometimes pulsing in patterns so subtle they resembled whispered footfalls from memory. The town quickly understood. The lights had begun remembering with them. This realization brought about a new practice, again, without planning or ceremony. Residents would gather beneath the trees at dusk, bringing old journals, sketches, family stories, pressed flowers, or even objects infused with the quiet history of a life. They would sit in loose circles, open their keepsakes, and allow them to drift above their items, illuminating memories with a tenderness no lantern or candle could match. These gatherings became known as evenings of soft remembrance. And in time, the gatherings revealed something even deeper. The lights did not simply respond to memory, they learned from it. They began forming shapes. Not literal, not sharp, not distinct, but soft silhouettes, forms woven from dim light that resembled the memory of a gesture. The tilt of a head, the gentle curve of a smile, the slow, familiar wave of a hand. One evening, an elderly man named Wren sat beneath the sycamores holding a faded photograph of his husband, who had passed many years earlier. As he traced the edge of the photo, a cluster of lights gathered near his shoulder. They shimmered, trembled, and slowly arranged themselves into a soft outline of a figure leaning toward him. Wren closed his eyes, tears slipping quietly down his cheeks, not of sorrow but of gratitude, and whispered, "Thank you." The lights pulsed once, as if acknowledging the sentiment. After that night, the town understood something profound. The lights had become keepers of memory, clouds of gentle, drifting remembrance that ensured no moment, no person, no breath was ever lost to time. The children of the town developed a tradition of memory walks, where they would stroll through the grove with orbs following like curious, floating companions. Elders found comfort in watching lights form soft patterns when recalling their childhoods. Travelers with heavy pasts often found themselves unburdened as lights drifted around them, absorbing not their pain, but the weight of being unseen. And always beneath the sycamores, the still one, silent, patient, eternal, appeared more frequently in dreams. Their presence grew steadier, more embodied. Dreamers described seeing the figure walking among the lights, guiding them into gentle spirals, lifting memories like leaves in autumn wind. One dreamer wrote in the archive ledger, "The still one carries the weight of stories the way a river carries moonlight, without effort, without loss." Another wrote, "They blinked once and the whole dream softened." As dream accounts grew more vivid, the apprentices began documenting them in a new series called The Ledger of Shared Dreams, adding dream descriptions side by side, lining up parallels, marveling at how entire groups dreamt similar landscapes, as though traversing the same quiet continent of sleep. Over generations, the phenomenon deepened. Dreamscapes expanded in scope. Dreamers recognized landmarks from one another's dreams, soft hills made of folded fabric, staircases carved from dusk, long hallways of warm lamplight where the still one sometimes waited, patient and wordless, offering presence rather than instruction. The entire town, it seemed, had begun dreaming a shared world. A world built not from mythology or fantasy, but from the collective softness of hearts that had rested together for centuries. The river hummed. The sycamores whispered. The glowed with memory. The sky breathed faintly with the town's rhythm. And the still one walked quietly through the dreams of all who slept there. And so the story, still without climax, without end, without urgency, continued its slow, luminous unfolding, deepening with every breath, every blink, every resting moment shared beneath the ancient canopy of leaves and light. And still the town drifted onward, not forward in any linear sense, but deeper, deeper into itself, deeper into its dreamlike way of being, deeper into the soft hum that had become its perpetual heartbeat. The land, the people, the sky, the breath of the community, everything moved as one continuous tide of calm. No one thought of this as remarkable. It simply was the natural evolution of a place that had learned to rest so completely that even time seemed to pause respectfully at its borders. As generations passed, the shared dreamscape grew more intricate, more familiar, more intertwined with waking life. People often woke with the faint imprint of a dream still on their skin, a warmth on their shoulders where a dream watcher had rested a hand, a glow in their peripheral vision where lights had hovered, a lingering sense of having walked along soft, winding paths lined with whispering trees. Children spoke freely of these shared dreams, as casually as others might speak of playgrounds or favorite hills. They described vast landscapes stitched together from memory and imagination, valleys filled with resting clouds, lakes that reflected not the sky but one's own emotional state, intricate floating bridges woven from drifting lights. They described the still one, too, not fearfully, but affectionately, like a distant relative who visited often in sleep. The still one grew clearer in these dreams with each generation. At first a soft silhouette, then a figure of blurred light, they began appearing in dreams as a distinct presence. Tall, luminous, serene, with eyes that blinked slowly as if marking the rhythm of the entire dream world. They did not speak. They did not command. They did not guide with urgency. They simply walked beside dreamers, their footsteps barely touching the dream soil, creating gentle ripples in the landscape that soothed every mind they approached. As dreamers began sharing their experiences in the waking world, the apprentices added these accounts to the ledger of shared dreams. Soon, the volumes into dozens, soft-bound books filled with descriptions of collective dream journeys, all echoing the same calming motifs. The apprentices noticed that nearly every dreamer, no matter their age or background, described the Still One's presence in almost identical terms. They felt like the quiet at the end of a comforting story. They blinked, and everything in the dream softened. Standing near them felt like being wrapped in a warm, slow breath. Meanwhile, a quieter transformation began unfolding in waking life. The lights, once drifting memory keepers, started forming gentle patterns in the air even when no memories were being recalled. They wove slow spirals above rooftops at dusk. They shaped arcs along pathways where children walked home from school. They hovered in luminous trails along the river, tracing the current like glowing punctuation marks. And ever so slowly, they began aligning themselves in deliberate formations, shapes that resembled the soft silhouettes seen in dreams. The lights were learning not just from memory, but from the shared dreamscape. On certain nights, when the moon hung low and full, the lights formed vast, luminous canopies above the sycamore grove, drifting into arrangements that resembled doorways or windows made of trembling light. People described these luminous structures as thresholds not to walk through, but simply to witness. They felt like invitations, like the dream world brushing lightly against the waking world, acknowledging their shared existence. It was during one such night of thresholds that an unprecedented phenomenon occurred. The apprentices, now elderly themselves, gathered beneath the sycamores with a circle of younger residents. As the lights drifted into their soft, arching patterns overhead, the trees began to sway in a rhythm no wind could have caused. The earth beneath the group vibrated faintly, the air thickening with a warmth that brushed against every cheek. Then, without warning but with perfect gentleness, a figure stepped from the darkness behind the grove. Not from between the trees, not from the shadows, but from a kind of softness in the air itself, as though a dream had exhaled into waking life. It was the Still One, not as a vague outline, not as shimmering suggestion, but as a fully manifested presence of quiet, glowing light, more real than any dream, yet so soft that looking directly at them felt like looking into a candle flame through half-closed eyes. The apprentices did not gasp or step back. The town had been preparing for this without realizing it. Generation after generation of rest, of shared dreams, of communal breath had slowly thinned the veil between sleep and waking. The Still One simply arrived when the town had become tranquil enough to receive their presence without fear or urgency. The figure stood before the group, their eyes half-lidded in perpetual calm. Their form seemed woven from sighs, from moonlit water, from the glow of memory lanterns. Their breath, if they breathed at all, matched the slow inhale and exhale of the entire town. For many long minutes, no one moved. And then something remarkable happened. Without speaking, without even lifting a hand, the Still One blinked. A single slow blink. An ancient, gentle blink. A blink that carried centuries of quiet observation. And as their eyelids drifted closed and open again, the lights above surged with a sudden, glowing warmth. The sycamores shuddered softly, their leaves shimmering like silver threads. The river hummed louder, as though echoing the heartbeat of the dream world. And every person present felt a wave of pure rest wash through their bodies. Relief, tranquility, release, the soft quiet of being known fully and judged not at all. Elder apprentices sank into peaceful sleep where they stood. Children leaned against the glowing trunks, drifting into shared dreams. The young felt a settling in their bones, as if the future had been lifted off their shoulders. And the still one simply remained, watching gently, the embodiment of all the town had ever been. No one knew how long they stood there, minutes, hours, a whole night. Time loosened its grip in their presence. When dawn finally approached, soft and pale, the still one slowly dissolved back into the faint morning haze, leaving behind only a lingering warmth in the air and a sense of profound completion. In the days that followed, the town changed again, but in the quiet way only this town could change. People slept more deeply than ever. Dreams grew richer, more interconnected. The lights brightened at dusk and remained visible even in early morning fog. The river's hum shifted into a deeper register, like a lullaby sung by the earth. It was clear now. The boundary between waking life and the shared dream world had thinned, not dangerously, but gently, lovingly, in harmony with the town's essence. Life continued unbroken. The archive shelves grew heavier with dream accounts. Children drew the still one with soft hands and sleepy smiles. Elders spoke of the visitation with gratitude, not awe. And the town, breathing as one, drifted onward into an era where waking and dreaming were simply two halves of the same endless rest. And still the story continued, quiet as dawn, soft as exhale, and infinite as a blink suspended in timeless calm. And still the story drifted onward, so softly, so steadily, that even those living within it could no longer tell where waking ended and dreaming began. The town existed now in a state best described not as sleep, not as consciousness, but as a gentle, perpetual betweenness, a twilight rhythm in which every breath, every blink, every hush of wind carried the same quiet intelligence. In the weeks following the still one's first waking appearance, the town experienced a transformation unlike any before. Not sudden, not dramatic, but deep and inward settling, as if the entire valley had exhaled a final long-held tension and allowed itself to sink fully into its own timeless rest. The sycamore grove became the center of this shift. Where once the lights had gathered only at night, now they drifted through the branches even in daylight, their glow softened by the sun to a pale, whispering shimmer. Travelers described them as daydream embers, floating remnants of a dream that refused to extinguish in the presence of light. Children reached for them casually, as naturally as one reaches for falling petals, and though the lights passed through their fingers, they often left behind a tiny warmth, soothing, steady, like the echo of a comforting hand on the shoulder. But the most remarkable transformation unfolded beneath the soil. Juniper's successors, caretakers of the land, began noticing subtle patterns in the sycamore's root formations. When they mapped the growth, they realized the roots were expanding outward in spirals, forming gentle, interconnected rings. The patterns resembled the dream thresholds formed by the lights, as though the trees were mirroring what the people dreamt, as though the land itself were learning the language of dreams. Researchers visiting from afar attempted to study these root spirals, but most abandoned their scientific instruments after a few days. The atmosphere dulled their urgency. Their questions softened. They found themselves sitting beneath the trees, simply watching the light drift, forgetting the need to analyze. Many ended up joining the nightly gatherings, adding new textures to the collective hum, contributing dreams of cities and ships and distant mountains that slowly folded into the town's shared dream geography. The dream world itself had been changing, too. What had once been vague landscapes, misty corridors, warm-lit halls, were now becoming stable, recognizable places. Dreamers described returning to the same meadows, the same rivers, the same softly glowing pathways carved by generations of dreamwalkers. They described a vast, expansive dream valley, draped in silver twilight, that resembled the waking town but felt more fluid, more luminous, more alive. This dream valley became known among the apprentices as the Quiet Mirror. And within the quiet mirror, the still one's presence grew ever more tangible. Dreamers reported, "They walk beside me now, like an old friend. When they blink, the dream breathes with them. Their silence feels fuller than sound." Children said the still one taught them new ways to rest. Adults said they taught them how to release grief without breaking. Elders said they saw glimpses of loved ones standing just behind the still one's light, smiling in the hush of dream air. The apprentices realized something monumental. The still one was no longer just a dream entity. They were becoming a bridge, a threshold, a shared breath between worlds. As this understanding spread, new customs emerged naturally, woven into the daily life of the town as seamlessly as sighs. At dawn, people gathered silently on the hillside to watch the lights return from their nighttime dance, drifting downward in thin streams like sleepy meteors. At midday, the marketplace paused in a ritual simply called the Soft Minute, a moment where everyone, regardless of occupation or urgency, set down what they were doing, closed their eyes and breathed together once, slow, deep, unified. At dusk, the children's humming circles, once spontaneous, became a cherished sight. Adults often joined, lending a deeper resonance to the hum, creating a layered harmony that seemed to coax the lights into brighter, more structured patterns. But the most profound development came in the deepest hours of night. Sometimes, rarely, unpredictably, the lights converged above the sycamores and formed what the townspeople later called the Resting Veil, a sweeping curtain of shimmering light that stretched from treetop to treetop, flowing slowly like woven water. Those who slept beneath it experienced dreams of such tranquility that even the oldest aches of the heart seemed to loosen and disperse. In these dreams, the still one often appeared, not as a guide, not as a teacher, but as a quiet companion who stood beside dreamers at the threshold of doors made of darkness and dawn. They never told dreamers where to go. They simply blinked slowly, as if saying, "You may rest. You may go forward. You may return. All paths are gentle here." In the waking world, people began speaking less in complete sentences and more in rhythms, phrases that drifted naturally into the cadence of their surroundings. "I'll meet you when the lights breathe tonight. Let's walk until the river hum matches our steps. Did you rest in the dream valley?" These weren't metaphors. They were simple descriptions of life now. And slowly, new generations grew up recognizing something extraordinary without needing it explained. They lived in two worlds at once: the waking town and the quiet mirror. Both shaped them. Both held them. Both taught them how to rest. No one sought to merge the worlds. No one feared their closeness. This union felt as natural as the space between inhale and exhale, a continuum rather than a divide. Even the sky adapted. On certain nights, stars flickered in slow, deliberate rhythms, mirroring the patterns of the town's collective breath. On others, thin auroras drifted through the valley, soft veils of light that resembled dream glow more than atmospheric phenomenon. Travelers who arrived during these nights sometimes fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the sight. Locals simply smiled and said, "The sky is resting with us tonight." And so the town continued, drifting deeper into its own harmonious existence, not isolated, not forgotten, but quietly radiant. A place where waking life and dreams walked hand in hand, where memories shone as softly as lanterns, where rest was not the absence of movement, but the presence of meaning, where the still one blinked slowly in dreams, and the whole valley softened in response. And still the story, without urgency, without end, unfolded in the gentlest possible way. A continuous, breathing lullaby whispered across generations, across worlds, across the infinite quiet between one heartbeat and the next. And so, in the final quiet stretch of the town's long and boundless history, there came a moment, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that arrives the way sleep arrives after a lifetime of rest, soft, inevitable, deeply welcome. The sky hung low with a warm dusk glow, the color of eyelids settling toward dream. The river hummed its familiar lullaby, slower now than ever, as if savoring each ripple. The sycamores leaned in a little closer to one another, their leaves whispering the last notes of a story that had been unfolding for generations upon generations. The townspeople gathered beneath those ancient branches, not out of ceremony, not out of expectation, but because something in the air, gentle as a sigh, called them there. Children rested their heads in the laps of elders. The apprentices, now aged and calm, sat shoulder to shoulder. Travelers who had stayed long enough to understand the rhythm of the place breathed in unison with those who had known it since birth. And then the lights began their final movement. Not drifting, not poolsing, but rising. Slowly, with the grace of a dream lifting itself from deep sleep, the lights ascended from the grove, rising higher than ever before. Their glow brightened into a soft radiance, not blinding but warm, like a memory of dawn remembered long after waking. Thousands of lights drifted upward, forming a great, shimmering constellation above the town, a constellation not written in the sky, but in the space between breath and silence. And in that moment, the still one appeared for the last time, not stepping from shadows, not forming from dream, not emerging from light. They were simply there, standing at the center of the grove, their presence so gentle that no one felt surprise, only peace. Their eyes, half-lidded as always, blinked once in a motion so slow and serene that the entire valley seemed to follow the rhythm. And when their eyes opened again, the constellation above shimmered in unison, as if acknowledging that final blink. The watchers in the dreams, the hum of the river, the whispers of the sycamores, the shared breath of generations. All of it, every thread of quiet history, wove together into a single, resting harmony. The still one lifted their face toward the constellation of drifting lights, exhaled a breath soft as a final lullaby, and began dissolving into the glow, light into light, rest into rest, dream into dream, until the figure became part of the very radiance above. The lights rose higher still, drifting upward like a great, gentle tide returning home, until they blended into the sky and became indistinguishable from the stars themselves. The townspeople watched in silence, not with sorrow, not with longing, but with the profound understanding that the story had come full circle. Their lives had become the dream. Their dreams had become the land. Their land had become the quiet legacy Elia's once began with a single, weary blink. When the last light vanished into the soft dusk, a warm stillness settled across the valley, the kind of stillness that marks the end of something vast and tender. And in that stillness, every person in the grove closed their eyes, not to sleep, but in gentle recognition. The story had finished. Its breath had ended. Its rhythm had stilled. Its quiet chapter had closed with perfect softness. And in the long silence that followed, the town, restful, whole, eternal in its calm, stepped peacefully into the endless dream it had been